today's video, we examine the worst deaths of climbers ever recorded, from experienced mountaineers making a reckless decision on the K2 to a chain of disastrous events risking an influencer's life on Everest. It was April 12, 2014, and the pre-dawn darkness over Mount Everest's Kumbu icefall hung thick with the kind of ominous stillness that experienced climbers recognize as deceptive calm. The massive icefall stretched like a frozen battlefield across the route to Base Camp 1, its towering seracs and hidden crevasses creating a labyrinth of death that shifted and groaned with each degree of temperature change. Blake Forrester, a 33-year-old marketing director for Summit Dynamics, an outdoor gear manufacturer based in Boulder, Colorado, had built his career on understanding the relationship between equipment performance and extreme environments. His background included multiple technical ice climbs throughout the Rocky Mountains, but he had never attempted anything in the Himalayas. Forrester's reputation within the industry was built on his ability to secure high-profile expedition sponsorships and document gear performance in challenging conditions, making him valuable to a company that depended on authentic field testing for marketing credibility. The Mount Everest expedition represented the centerpiece of Summit Dynamics' spring marketing campaign designed to showcase their new, high-altitude equipment line in the most demanding environment on Earth. Forrester had spent 8 months negotiating the sponsorship deal, securing media coverage, and coordinating with expedition leaders to ensure maximum marketing impact from the investment. The financial stakes for Forrester personally were significant beyond his immediate job security. He carried a mortgage on a Boulder home, student loan debt from his graduate studies, and had recently committed to a $15,000 investment in a small climbing guide service with his partner. Losing his position at Summit Dynamics would eliminate his ability to service these debts and potentially force the sale of his home in a challenging real estate market. The climbing industry's tight-knit nature meant that failure on such a high-profile expedition could damage his professional reputation for years. This expedition to Mount Everest represented the culmination of Summit Dynamics' 18-month marketing campaign for their new high-altitude equipment line. Forrester's expedition leader had cached critical prototype gear on a ledge in the Kumbu icefall during an emergency evacuation when a team member suffered severe altitude sickness. The cached equipment included revolutionary oxygen delivery systems, advanced insulation layers utilizing aerogel technology, and titanium alloy climbing hardware offering superior strength-to-weight ratios. These prototypes represented years of research and development, making their recovery essential for the company's upcoming product launch. Successful recovery and documentation would likely result in Forrester's promotion to marketing vice president, a position that came with significant salary increases and company equity participation. The marketing data from Everest would provide Summit Dynamics with competitive advantages and potential revenue, as authentic high-altitude testing remained the gold standard for equipment credibility in the mountaineering community. The Kumbu icefall is one of the most dangerous sections of the standard route up Mount Everest, where the glacier flows over a steep drop and fractures into a chaotic maze of crevasses and towering ice blocks called seracs. These seracs, some weighing hundreds of tons, shift constantly due to glacier movement and temperature fluctuations, making the icefall an active avalanche zone where death can strike without warning. At 19,200 feet elevation, the icefall's thin atmosphere and extreme cold create additional challenges for climbers attempting technical maneuvers. Temperature variations in the icefall can exceed 40 degrees Fahrenheit between night and early morning, creating thermal stress that weakens ice structures and triggers collapses. The optimal crossing time occurs between 4 a.m. and 8 a.m., when overnight freezing has maximally strengthened ice formations. But even during these safe hours, the probability of serac collapse remains significant enough that most climbers minimize their exposure time through rapid movement. On the morning of April 12th, meteorological conditions appeared ideal for icefall travel, with clear skies, minimal wind, and temperatures holding steady around -15 degrees Fahrenheit at the 19,000-foot level. However, weather stations at base camp had recorded an unusual warming trend over the previous 72 hours, with daytime temperatures reaching 45 degrees Fahrenheit at lower elevations. This temperature differential created thermal stress throughout the icefall's ice formations, causing increased movement and instability that experienced climbers could detect through subtle audio cues and visual observations. The route through the icefall requires technical climbing skills, proper equipment, and intimate knowledge of current conditions that only experienced Himalayan guides possess. Standard protocol involves teams of climbers roped together, moving quickly through established routes while maintaining constant communication with base camp controllers who monitor conditions via telescope and radio contact. Solo travel through the icefall violates fundamental safety principles that have evolved through decades of climbing deaths and near misses. Icefall doctors, specialized Sherpa teams responsible for maintaining the route through the chaotic ice formations, had declared the standard path unsafe for the past 48 hours due to increased Sirac movement observed during recent temperature fluctuations. These teams, whose lives depend on accurate assessment of ice conditions, had noted unusual creaking sounds from major Sirac formations and observed fresh cracks appearing in previously stable ice structures. Their decision to close the route represented the consensus of the most experienced ice climbers in the world. Base camp managers had posted explicit warnings prohibiting solo entry into the icefall zone and stationed personnel at the primary access point to monitor the closure. The monitors, veteran climbing Sherpas with decades of Everest experience, had instructions to strongly discourage climbers from entering the icefall regardless of their stated intentions or urgency. Other climbing teams in the area, including groups with commercial pressures and tight scheduling requirements, had accepted the delay without question. Expedition leaders with millions of dollars invested in their climbs understood that attempting to navigate unstable terrain represented unacceptable risk regardless of financial consequences. Several teams had extended their base camp stays by a week, choosing to absorb additional costs rather than risk their members' lives. Forrester observed the ice conditions personally during the evening of April 11th, noting visible steam rising from crevasses as warmer air temperatures created sublimation of ice surfaces. He could hear the distinctive popping and cracking sounds that indicated thermal stress within ice formations, along with occasional thunderous crashes as smaller seracs collapsed in distant sections of the icefall. These observable warning signs reinforced the icefall doctor's professional assessment of dangerous conditions. Despite these clear indicators of instability, Forrester faced an impossible choice between his professional obligations and his personal safety. Summit Dynamics' sponsorship contract included a strict clause requiring the return of prototype equipment within 72 hours of expedition termination or face immediate contract cancellation and a $25,000 penalty for unreturned gear. The contract language, negotiated during a highly competitive bidding process, contained no provisions for force majeure or safety-related delays that might prevent equipment recovery. His company's financial situation added urgency to the gear recovery mission. Summit Dynamics had invested heavily in the Everest marketing campaign at the expense of other promotional activities, leaving their annual marketing budget stretched to its limits. Company executives had made clear that the prototype gear's performance documentation was essential for their autumn product launch, which represented their primary revenue opportunity for the following fiscal year. Failure to deliver the marketing materials could result in significant layoffs within the marketing department. Local Sherpa guides, whose intimate knowledge of icefall conditions had kept them alive through decades of Himalayan guiding, unanimously refused to accompany any recovery mission until the route reopened. Their refusal represented the strongest possible warning about current ice conditions, as Sherpa guides typically show remarkable tolerance for calculated risks when properly compensated. Even offers of triple the standard daily rate failed to persuade any guides to enter the icefall, demonstrating their assessment that the conditions presented unacceptable mortality risk. The Sherpa community's collective refusal carried particular weight given their economic dependence on climbing expeditions and reluctance to disappoint foreign climbers who provided essential family income. When guides who regularly accept dangerous assignments for modest pay refuse additional work, it indicates conditions exceeding even their considerable risk tolerance. Their unanimous position that gear recovery should wait represented professional consensus based on observable evidence of extreme danger. Even experienced expedition leaders at base camp, including climbers who had successfully summited Everest multiple times, advised Forrester to accept the financial penalty rather than attempt solo gear recovery in closed terrain. These leaders, whose reputations depended on accurate risk assessment and whose business models required managing client safety, understood the distinction between acceptable mountaineering risk and reckless endangerment. Forrester spent the evening of April 11th studying topographical maps and identifying an alternate access point that would bypass the guarded main route while still reaching his cached equipment. He located a secondary approach used primarily for emergency evacuations that accessed the icefall from the western margin, avoiding the main guard post while still providing access to the GPS coordinates where his team had stored the prototype gear. This route required additional technical climbing, but offered the possibility of reaching his objective without confronting base camp security. Before departing, he established comprehensive radio check protocols with base camp dispatch, scheduling contact every hour beginning at 8 a.m. to ensure monitoring of his safety throughout the operation. This communication plan was designed to enable rapid rescue response, though he understood that rescue operations in the icefall carried extreme risks for potential rescuers. Forrester's equipment selection reflected his understanding of the technical requirements while minimizing weight for rapid movement. He carried 200 feet of dynamic climbing rope rated for high-impact loads, a rack of ice climbing hardware, including screws and pickets for anchor construction, and a lightweight pack capable of holding the cached prototype gear. His personal protective equipment included an avalanche beacon, climbing helmet, and emergency bivouac gear sufficient for one night's survival at altitude. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, Forrester bypassed the route guard by accessing the icefall through the secondary emergency approach, following a narrow corridor between two large sea racks that provided concealment from the main base camp area. His headlamp illuminated the twisted landscape of ice blocks and crevasses as he picked his way carefully toward the GPS coordinates where his team had cached the equipment 7 days earlier. The route required technical climbing over several ice formations and careful navigation around crevasses that could prove fatal if he lost his footing. The morning temperature held steady around -12 degrees Fahrenheit at his elevation, providing optimal conditions for ice stability while he moved through the lower sections of the icefall. However, he observed fresh cracks in several ice formations that indicated recent movement, along with debris from minor collapses that had occurred during the previous day's warming cycle. The crevasse itself had widened by approximately 6 inches since his team's original crossing, requiring him to span a 12-foot gap rather than the 11-foot distance they had encountered the previous week. Forrester began installing his Tyrolean traverse system by identifying suitable anchor points on both sides of the crevasse that could withstand the forces generated by his rope system under load. This technique involves stretching a rope between 2 anchor points and using it as a bridge while hanging from a harness system, requiring precise placement of anchors capable of holding several times the climber's body weight under dynamic loading conditions. His anchor installation process involved drilling deep holes in solid ice using specialized screws designed for extreme load applications, then testing each placement by applying significant force to ensure that ice would hold under the stress of the complete traverse system. He installed primary and backup anchors on both sides of the crevasse that would prevent catastrophic failure if any single component failed under load. At 6:45 a.m., after over 2 hours of careful anchor installation, Forrester completed his anchor system and conducted comprehensive testing of the rope tension and anchor security by applying his full body weight while still positioned on the safe side of the crevasse. The ice anchors held firm during testing, and he observed no visible movement or stress indicators in the immediately surrounding ice formations. His load testing confirmed that the system could support his current body weight with appropriate safety margins. The gear cache contained exactly what Summit Dynamics required for their marketing campaign. The complete cache weighed approximately 40 pounds, representing a significant increase over his body weight that would substantially change the dynamics of his traverse system. Forrester methodically packed each piece of prototype equipment into his expedition pack. He photographed each item with a digital camera to document the gear's condition for the company's marketing materials, understanding that visual proof of the equipment's survival at extreme altitude would enhance its credibility with potential customers. As he arranged the gear to optimize weight distribution, he positioned the heaviest items closest to his back to maintain proper center of gravity, while ensuring that fragile components were protected by clothing layers and positioned away from potential impact points. The loaded pack created bulk that would complicate his movement on the traverse system. At 7:15 a.m., Forrester began his return crossing with the full gear load, immediately noticing the significant difference in the system's behavior under the increased weight. The loaded pack shifted his center of gravity and required constant adjustment to maintain proper position relative to the traverse line. Halfway across the crevasse, he observed hairline cracks developing around his primary ice anchor point, where the increased loading was concentrating stress in the surrounding ice formation. Despite the visible signs of stress in his anchor system, the traverse continued to support his weight as he progressed toward the safe side of the crevasse. After progressing slowly for nearly 10 minutes due to the additional weight, he estimated that he had covered approximately 8 feet of the 12-foot crossing when the temperature-related failure sequence began. Morning sunlight, reflecting off snow surfaces and concentrating in the protected crevasse environment, had begun raising local temperatures above the critical threshold where ice formations lose their structural integrity. The failure occurred simultaneously from multiple stress points as thermal expansion and the dynamic loading of his traverse system combined to exceed the structural capacity of his anchor installation. At 7:25 a.m., his primary anchor point catastrophically failed when the ice formation holding his traverse system suddenly cracked and shifted under the combined effects of thermal stress. The anchor failure created an immediate shock load that propagated through the ice structure above the crevasse. For several seconds, the ice groaned ominously before this shock loading triggered the collapse of a massive serac estimated to weigh over 2 tons that had been held in position by ice structures now compromised by thermal cycling and the vibrations from Forrester's anchor failure. The serac collapse sequence happened with terrifying speed as the towering ice formation, destabilized by the anchor failure and morning temperature increase, broke free from its foundation with a thunderous crack that echoed throughout the icefall. The massive ice block, roughly 15 feet tall and 8 feet wide, plummeted toward the crevasse crossing where Forrester hung suspended and helpless on his failed traverse system, with no opportunity to escape the falling debris. Forrester's position at the moment of serac impact placed him directly beneath the falling ice mass, suspended approximately 20 feet above the crevasse floor and unable to reach either side of the crossing before the collapse reached his location. The failed anchor had eliminated his ability to continue the traverse, while the bulk and weight of his gear pack prevented rapid movement that might have allowed escape from the impact zone. The impact was instantaneous and devastating as the 2-ton ice block struck Forrester with the kinetic energy of a falling building, crushing his body completely while simultaneously destroying his rope system and scattering the recovered prototype equipment across a 50-foot debris field. The massive force compressed his chest cavity, severing his spinal cord and crushing vital organs. Death was immediate as the overwhelming trauma exceeded the human body's capacity to maintain life functions. The serac's impact drove Forrester's body deep into the fresh ice debris. The prototype equipment he had risked his life to recover was embedded throughout the debris field, some pieces driven 30 feet from the impact site by the force of the collapse. His avalanche beacon continued transmitting from beneath approximately 15 feet of compacted ice fragments that had set into a concrete hard mass within minutes of the collapse. The thunderous crash of the Serac collapse echoed across the icefall and reached base camp over a mile away at exactly 7:27 a.m., where expedition leaders immediately recognized the distinctive sound of a major ice collapse. Radio operators attempted to contact Forrester for his scheduled 8 a.m. check-in, but received only silence from his radio frequency. His failure to respond triggered immediate concern among base camp personnel who understood the implications of missed communications in the icefall environment. Base camp dispatch immediately organized a search and rescue team despite the dangerous conditions. Understanding that any remote chance of survival required immediate response, regardless of the risks to rescuers. The rescue team, composed of experienced Sherpa guides and Western climbers with technical rescue training, departed base camp at 8:30 a.m., carrying specialized equipment for crevasse rescue and medical emergencies. The rescue team reached Forrester's last known position at 9:15 a.m., where they immediately detected his avalanche beacon signal emanating from beneath the fresh ice debris. The signal strength indicated burial at a depth that would require hours of excavation with heavy tools, while the continued instability of surrounding seracs made any prolonged work in the area extremely dangerous for the rescue team members. Scattered pieces of climbing gear and prototype equipment were visible on the surface of the debris field, confirming the location of the collapse and providing evidence of the violence of the Serac impact. The rescue team leader made the difficult decision that excavation would present unacceptable risk to additional lives, particularly given the depth of the beacon signal and the obvious severity of the impact trauma that had occurred. The coroner's report, filed without body recovery due to the dangerous conditions and depth of burial, listed the cause of death as massive traumatic injuries due to Serac collapse, with contributing factors including violation of icefall closure protocols, solo travel in unstable terrain, and equipment failure under excessive loading. The report noted that death would have been instantaneous, given the magnitude of the impact forces involved in the collapse. GPS coordinates of Forrester's burial site were permanently marked in expedition databases as a location to avoid, with notes about the Serac collapse pattern and remaining debris field. It was July 18, 2016. A temporary break in the jet stream opened over K2's northeast ridge, briefly easing the relentless winds that dominate the upper Karakoram. At base camp, the Baltoro Glacier lay locked in ice beneath a pale morning sky, while spindrift streamed from the upper slopes in long, wind-torn plumes that hinted at how quickly conditions could change. Zeke Febrio was a 34-year-old software engineer from Boulder, Colorado, who had turned to high-altitude mountaineering after leaving the tech industry. Analytical by nature, he approached climbing the way he once approached engineering problems, methodically, data-driven, and intolerant of shortcuts. He had completed multiple guided expeditions and formal alpine training programs, building a resume that included successful ascents of Denali and Aconcagua. His focus on preparation and systems made him the logistical planner of the team. His climbing partner, Sean Marillis, was 29 and worked as an emergency room physician in Flagstaff, Arizona. Years in trauma medicine had shaped his risk awareness and his insistence on redundancy in life support systems, whether in a hospital or on a mountain. Sean had climbed Cho Oyu the previous year, gaining his first experience above 26,000 feet, and had developed a strong interest in altitude physiology. Within the partnership, he was responsible for monitoring health, hydration, and early signs of altitude-related illness. The two had been climbing together for nearly 2 years and shared a similar approach to risk. Conservative decision-making paired with a willingness to commit fully once objective criteria were met. Both believed K2 was achievable if timing, weather, and discipline aligned precisely. K2 base camp sat at approximately 16,900 feet on the Pakistani side of the mountain, at the foot of the Abruzzi Spur. Unlike Everest, the camp infrastructure was sparse and utilitarian, reflecting the mountain's reputation for technical difficulty and high fatality rates. Temperatures that morning hovered near 5 degrees Fahrenheit, with steady winds funneling down the glacier. Despite the apparent calm, both climbers understood that K2's history was defined not by summit success, but by how often climbers failed to return from the upper mountain. But beneath their outward confidence, both climbers were operating under pressures that narrowed their margin for retreat. K2 expeditions demanded months of time, extensive financial investment, and a tolerance for prolonged uncertainty. Zeke had committed a significant portion of his post-divorce savings to the climb, including permits, logistics, and high-altitude equipment. A failed summit attempt would not only represent a personal disappointment, but the effective end of his ability to fund another K2 season. For Shan, the cost was professional rather than financial. His unpaid leave from the hospital had been carefully negotiated and could not be extended without jeopardizing his position. This window represented his only opportunity to attempt the mountain that year. K2's northeast ridge is among the most technically demanding routes on any 8,000-meter peak. Above 25,000 feet, the mountain funnels climbers into exposed terrain dominated by the bottleneck, a narrow couloir threatened by hanging seracs and steep ice faces. The route offers no safe shelter once climbers commit beyond Camp 4. Storm systems moving across the Karakoram can accelerate rapidly, turning manageable conditions into lethal exposure within hours. Retreat options diminish sharply with altitude, and delays compound exponentially in the thin air. In the days leading up to July 18th, Zeke monitored multiple forecasting services from base camp, cross-referencing satellite data, wind models, and historical jet stream behavior. The forecast showed a marginal window, approximately 30 to 36 hours of reduced winds at summit level, followed by a high probability of rapid deterioration. The data did not promise favorable conditions, only survivable ones. It was the type of window K2 climbers often debated for days, knowing that waiting carried no guarantee of improvement. Other teams at base camp reached different conclusions. 2 commercial expeditions announced delays, citing concern over upper-level winds and instability near the bottleneck. One independent team abandoned their summit plans entirely after receiving updated forecasts showing strengthening winds above 27,000 feet late on July 20th. Conversations in the mess tent reflected a shared understanding that the window was narrow and unforgiving. On the evening of July 18th, updated weather data confirmed that conditions had stabilized earlier than expected. Wind speeds at Camp 4 elevations were briefly lower than forecast, and visibility had improved across the upper mountain. The same update, however, showed increasing uncertainty beyond the following day. Shan reviewed the data with a clinical eye, noting that even a minor delay during the summit push would push their descent into the edge of the next system. Success depended on strict adherence to timelines with no room for error. Despite these concerns, neither climber voiced serious consideration of abandoning the attempt. Each warning they acknowledged, marginal forecasts, other teams turning back, the absence of contingency shelters above Camp 4, was weighed against the reality that this was likely their only opportunity. With no guarantee of another weather window and limited ability to wait weeks longer, committing themselves to a plan that assumed optimal execution under conditions known to change without warning. The pressure surrounding the climb increased as the window approached. Both climbers understood that the financial and logistical investment already committed would not be recoverable if they stood down. Zeke reviewed his remaining supplies and calculated that waiting more than a few additional days at base camp would strain both oxygen reserves and food margins. Sean, aware that his leave from the hospital had a fixed end date, recognized that abandoning the attempt would likely end his opportunity to climb K2 altogether. With a narrow weather window and no guarantee of another attempt, the climbers pressed on, knowing delay could cost them the summit entirely. On the morning of July 19th, the two met at the base camp staging area and conducted a final equipment review. Each item was checked against their ascent plan. Both climbers carried personal medical kits, with Sean responsible for emergency medications and monitoring protocols. Their gear reflected a conservative approach for K2, light enough for speed, but with minimal redundancy above Camp 4. They departed base camp shortly after 4 a.m., moving on to the lower slopes of the Abruzzi Spur. The initial terrain was familiar from earlier rotations, allowing them to settle into a steady pace. The glacier provided some shelter from the wind, and conversation during the first hours focused on pacing, hydration reminders, and minor route adjustments observed during previous climbs. Both appeared physically strong, showing no early signs of fatigue or altitude distress. After several hours of ascent, they reached the established route toward Camp 3. The terrain steepened, and the exposure increased as the spur narrowed. Wind speeds were moderate but noticeable, requiring frequent pauses to manage balance while placing protection. From this elevation, visibility varied. Clear views down the glacier contrasted with upper slopes, intermittently obscured by thin cloud bands moving quickly across the ridge. Throughout the climb, some climbers reported stable progress at lower camps, while others mentioned concerns about wind behavior higher on the mountain. One team announced their decision to halt their ascent and reassess conditions the following day. Zeke acknowledged the transmissions but did not relay them in detail, focusing instead on maintaining their planned timeline and conserving energy. As they continued upward toward Camp 3, they encountered a descending climber from another expedition. The climber reported slower than expected progress above and noted increasing wind near the upper sections of the route. He mentioned that conditions near the bottleneck appeared more complex than during previous days, with snow accumulation affecting established lines. The information was specific and based on recent movement, but it did not clearly indicate an immediate hazard. Zeke and Sean paused briefly to consider the report. Zeke asked several technical questions about anchor placement, slope angles, and snow consistency, demonstrating his awareness of the risks. Sean cross-referenced their oxygen supply, climbing timeline, and the limited hours of daylight remaining. Despite the specificity of the report, both climbers chose to continue. They rationalized that their acclimatization, technical experience, and knowledge of the route allowed them to manage the hazards safely. This decision represented a crucial turning point. Under normal circumstances, either climber might have paused or descended to reassess conditions. Both had extensive experience making conservative calls in high-altitude scenarios, and their prior rotations had reinforced the importance of risk management. Yet the window for weather, combined with their limited time at base camp, introduced a cognitive bias. The desire to reach the summit overrode their usual conservatism. The climb had become more than a goal. It was a culmination of months of preparation, personal sacrifice, and significant financial and logistical investment. As they gained elevation above Camp 3, the slope steepened, and the environment became more exposed. Winds intensified sharply, forcing both climbers to lean into their poles and dig each step carefully. Snow conditions shifted dramatically. The soft layers of earlier rotations were replaced by wind-packed slabs and intermittent crusts, indicating redistribution and unstable buildup. Sean was the first to voice concern. He noted the wind's increasing strength and the snow's unusual consistency, emphasizing that movement across the slope now required additional caution. His medical background and prior high-altitude experience highlighted the risks of fatigue combined with exposure. He suggested a potential pause to reassess, pointing out that visibility was beginning to fluctuate unpredictably and that the terrain above included significant fall hazards. Zeke responded with reassurance, drawing on years of mountaineering experience and familiarity with K2's Abruzzi Spur. He emphasized that they were committed to the route and within their planned window. He explained that the summit remained achievable, that previous technical checks had confirmed anchor stability, and that the remaining exposure was manageable. What he did not acknowledge at the time were the subtle but accumulating risks. The decision to continue was informed as much by the imperatives of timing and preparation as by immediate safety assessments. The psychological weight on Zeke and Sean increased with every step above Camp 3. Even as conditions worsened, the thought of turning back before the bottleneck felt nearly impossible. By late morning on July 21st, they had broken above 26,000 feet, entering the death zone, where every movement demanded exponentially more energy and every breath carried less oxygen. The wind intensified sharply, blowing across exposed ridges and creating intermittent whiteout conditions. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet at times. The transition from Camp 3's relative shelter to the exposed ridges was immediate and punishing. The snowpack was unstable. Wind-packed slabs over brittle ice layers hinted at hidden weakness, leaving almost no margin for error. He commented that the slopes looked different than during their ascent, with increased accumulation in couloirs and evidence of recent snow slippage. The brittle, hollow sound of the wind slabs under their crampons indicated unstable layers beneath a deceptively firm surface. Each step required deliberate probing and constant attention to balance. Zeke recognized the same indicators: wind-loaded snow, drifting slabs, and the shifting seracs above. His engineering mindset prompted him to analyze every step, from anchor placement to micro-terrain hazards. But he also felt the pressure of time and diminishing weather windows. Both climbers discussed briefly the possibility of halting or bivouacking temporarily, but their deliberation was constrained by cognitive bias and the subtle urgency imposed by the narrow weather window. They rationalized continuing, their prior experience on 8,000-meter peaks. Familiarity with the route and use of supplemental oxygen made the ascent manageable, even under worsening conditions. The decision to push forward represented a breakdown in conservative risk management principles that had guided both climbers in previous high-altitude scenarios. Indicators all argued for a halt or descent. Yet the psychological and environmental pressures created a parallel decision-making path where the immediate objective of reaching the summit overrode the usual assessment of safety margins. Zeke led the way across the ridge, carefully placing ice screws and probing the wind slabs, while Shan followed, monitoring their pace, oxygen supply, and each other's physical and cognitive status. Soon after leaving the relative safety of Camp 4, Zeke and Shan approached the bottleneck at 27,200 feet, one of K2's most notorious technical hazards. The couloir's steep walls funneled wind and recent snowfall into unstable slabs across the slope, creating a deceptively smooth surface that concealed fractures and weak snow layers beneath. Even minor missteps in this section could trigger catastrophic failure. Visibility was limited by intermittent blowing snow, making it impossible to see the full extent of the exposed terrain or potential escape routes. Zeke paused briefly to check conditions and plan their route, the nagging intuition in his gut whispering that the mountain could shift faster than their calculations. This assessment reflected both his careful technical training and the mental necessity of justifying the high-risk push. Both climbers knew the bottleneck was infamous for icefall and avalanches. Their plan relied on cautious movement and precise route finding. The climbers proceeded in a deliberate sequence, testing each step with ice axes and probing the snow for hidden weaknesses. Their intention was to maintain control while moving through the exposed section. The first 50 vertical feet felt manageable. Their crampons gripped the ice reliably. The snowpack held firm beneath them. The steep slope, combined with recent wind deposition, created the illusion of stability, a deceptive surface that belied the fragility beneath. Zeke moved first, placing protection at regular intervals and scanning the terrain ahead. Each movement was controlled, calculated, and technically sound. Shan followed immediately, reviewing their oxygen use and energy expenditure, while observing subtle signs of snow instability. As Zeke began negotiating the narrowest part of the couloir, the snowpack showed the same layered instability that had made them pause at several prior points. Under normal circumstances, this observation would have prompted a retreat or bivouac, but the climbers' commitment to the summit and the limited forecast window created a powerful cognitive bias. They interpreted the firm feel under their feet as sufficient confirmation that the slope was safe, an assessment that, unbeknownst to them, would soon prove fatally wrong. Zeke took a deep breath and moved along the line he had chosen, keeping a careful distance from Shan. At first, the climbing felt smooth. Each movement was deliberate. Every step is a negotiation with gravity and chance. For a brief moment, it seemed their skill and preparation might carry them safely through one of the deadliest sections of the mountain. A fraction of a second later, a thin, poorly bonded layer of snow and ice beneath Zeke's crampons fractured, a warning neither climber could escape. The weakness spread quickly across the couloir, turning a minor slip into a cascading failure far beyond their control. The snow slab began moving as a single, massive sheet down the steep chute. At first it slid slowly, giving the illusion of control. Then gravity took over. The icy surface accelerated, and the mass became unstoppable. Zeke swung his ice axe and dug in with his crampons, but the weight and speed of the moving snow were too great. He was swept sideways, tumbling violently against exposed rock outcrops. When he finally came to rest, he was partially buried in a small ice alcove, battered, bruised, and disoriented, but alive. Shan, following just behind, had almost no time to react. The avalanche cut off his descent path, and the fractured snow beneath him gave way. His oxygen mask slipped, tumbling over jagged ice and rock. Debris pressed down on him, restricting his breathing. Each movement to free himself drained precious energy, and the thin, oxygen-deprived air made every effort feel exponentially harder. The avalanche's sheer power threw both climbers into isolated pockets within the couloir. Zeke had landed near a rock face, while Shan was trapped in a snow-filled depression several yards below. Despite their technical skill and calm decision-making in normal circumstances, the forces at work exceeded anything they could counter. Exhaustion sapped their energy. The thin air made each step harder. Trauma from tumbling weakened their control further. By the time weather conditions improved and other climbers at lower camps could observe the scene, Zeke and Shan remained immobilized. The snowpack had stabilized around them, leaving them unable to climb out or descend further. Attempts to radio base camp for assistance were hampered by frozen equipment and limited visibility, while supplemental oxygen ran critically low. When rescue parties reached the area hours later, both climbers were found barely conscious in the death zone, each suffering from severe hypothermia, frostbite, and exhaustion. Zeke had managed only a few meters in a final attempt to descend before collapsing, while Shan was incapacitated entirely. Despite immediate evacuation efforts, neither survived the prolonged exposure. The mountain does not forgive hesitation, nor does it reward skill alone. Recovery teams later documented that both climbers had achieved the summit at 28,251 feet, confirmed by GPS data recovered from their devices. The summit's success, however, provided no protection against the fatal combination of environmental hazards and delayed descent. The final report concluded the official cause of death as hypothermia, with contributing factors of high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, and the unavoidable risk inherent to the extreme environment of K2's bottleneck. Their summit success underscores the skill and determination required for K2, but even expertise cannot always overcome the mountain's unforgiving environment. It was February 14, 2015, just after sunrise, on the upper reaches of Huntington Ravine on Mount Washington. Winds at lower elevations appeared manageable, and from the trailhead, the mountain looked deceptively stable. But weather bulletins issued earlier that morning warned of rapidly increasing winds and whiteout conditions moving in from the west. Forecasters described it as a tightening window, not a clearing one. Despite those warnings, 4 climbers had already committed to the ravine, moving upward under the belief that the worst conditions had passed, and that belief would shape every decision that followed. Arthur Brooke was 34 years old and served as the guide for the group. He worked remotely as a software quality assurance tester for a small tech firm in Portland, and guiding weekend climbs helped supplement his income while building experience toward more advanced certifications. Climbing had also become his structure after a recent divorce. It gave him direction when other parts of his life felt unstable. Arthur was not reckless in the usual sense. He followed procedures, knew the terrain, and had completed multiple winter ascents. But he was deeply invested in finishing this climb. It was a requirement he needed to complete before qualifying for a higher-level technical course later that year. Missing it would mean rescheduling losing money he couldn't easily replace, and delaying progress he had worked years to reach. Huntington Ravine is a steep, bowl-shaped glacial cirque carved into the east face of Mount Washington, and it behaves very differently from the lower slopes below it. In winter, the terrain acts like a wind tunnel. Air accelerates as it's forced into the confined walls, then rebounds unpredictably off rock bands and ice faces. Gusts don't arrive evenly. They slam laterally, twisting ropes, loading anchors from the side, and pushing climbers off balance at the exact moments when precision matters most. Ice forms in layers that can look solid from a distance, but are often thin veneers over granite, bonded just enough to hold weight until a sudden change in force causes them to shear. As elevation increases, the angle steepens, protection options narrow, and retreat routes overlap with ascent lines, meaning any reversal requires the same technical commitment as going up, often more. The warnings issued that morning reflected those realities. Forecasts called for sustained winds exceeding 80 miles per hour at elevation, with gusts strong enough to strip ice from the walls and collapse visibility into whiteout conditions before midday. Huntington Ravine was specifically flagged as high risk because wind loading there doesn't just make climbing harder. It actively destabilizes anchors and turns minor slips into uncontrollable swings. In that terrain, timing is everything. A route that feels manageable early can become mechanically hostile within a few hundred vertical feet, long before climbers have a clear signal that conditions have crossed the line from difficult to unrecoverable. That day, Arthur had checked the forecast at the trailhead. Phone records showed his phone contained cached forecasts and screenshots from earlier updates. Later advisories were not saved or accessed. When the others asked about conditions, Arthur told them the weather looked clear and was expected to improve, pointing to a possible break later in the day. He did not mention the active wind warning or the forecasted increase in gusts. No one else checked for themselves, and the group moved forward on his word. From there, the climb shifted from weighing risk to maintaining progress. The forecast itself never changed, and the weather that followed matched the warnings issued earlier that morning. What changed was what the group believed, and once they entered the ravine, retreat was no longer a simple option. The group left Pinkham Notch just after sunrise. Temperatures were well below freezing, but the forest sheltered them from the wind, and visibility remained clear. The first hour passed without incident, reinforcing the sense that the plan was holding. Arthur set a steady pace, speaking calmly and keeping the group moving. By the time they broke above treeline, the mountain began to show signs of what had been forecast. Wind moved across the snow in sharp bursts, strong enough to force brief pauses. Snow skimmed sideways along the slope instead of settling. The temperature dropped further, and the open terrain offered no protection. These were not yet extreme conditions, but they were early indicators that the window was closing faster than expected. At around 4,200 feet, steady gusts began cutting through the ravine. Climbers later described having to widen their stance and lean into the slope to keep their balance as the wind pushed sideways across the ice. Arthur stopped the group briefly and looked up the ravine before telling them the conditions were still manageable. According to post-incident statements, he said the wind was expected to ease higher up and that they were still on schedule to move through the technical section before anything deteriorated. Climbers from another party lower in the ravine later said the wind was already strong enough to affect balance at that point, forcing deliberate foot placement and frequent pauses. They watched Arthur's group stop briefly, then continue upward into the narrowing section of the ravine. The group moved on after Arthur said conditions were still workable, relying on his call as the guide, while the wind continued to build around them. By mid-morning, the ravine no longer felt open. The walls seemed closer, fading in and out as wind-driven snow erased depth and contrast. Sound flattened into a constant rush, making it hard to tell where the wind ended and the terrain began. Verbal communication dropped off. The group relied on rope tension and quick hand signals, small cues that worked only as long as everything stayed predictable. At around 10:30 a.m., visibility tightened to roughly 50 feet. Snow lifted off the ravine floor and moved sideways, scraping across the ice rather than falling from above. The wind stopped cycling and settled into a steady force, pressing against the climbers and loading the face unevenly. One climber suggested stopping to reassess. Arthur, guiding the group, said turning back would mean down climbing through the same wind without anchors already in place. He told them the system had stabilized and that continuing upward was the safer option. The group accepted that explanation and moved on. From that point forward, the climb was no longer being evaluated. It was being carried out. Just after 11 a.m., the group reached the technical ice section of the ravine. The slope steepened to roughly 70 degrees, eliminating any chance to stand upright or regroup comfortably. From that point on, every climber relied fully on crampon points, ice tools, and the rope system. The ice appeared solid at first glance, hard and blue, but it had been scoured by wind for hours. In places, the surface masked thinner layers beneath, where bonding to the rock was uneven and unpredictable. By around 11:15 a.m., sustained winds were strong enough to push climbers sideways, with sharper gusts cutting through the ravine. Verbal communication was no longer practical. Each climber focused on maintaining balance and placing tools carefully, moving one at a time to limit exposure. Turning around was no longer straightforward. The terrain required upward progress to reach any position where a controlled retreat could be organized. Arthur moved third on the rope as they entered the steepest section. The anchor above him had been placed quickly to reduce time spent exposed, driven into ice that looked dense from the surface. There was no secondary screw in place. Time, exposure, and wind pressure had narrowed the setup to a single placement. It was a practical choice under worsening conditions. And from that point forward, the entire system depended on that placement holding against increasing wind and load. As the ravine narrowed, the wind began to funnel straight into the line of ascent. Gusts hit from the side, pulling climbers away from the wall and loading the rope unevenly. The rope stayed tight and vibrated under tension. Small shards of ice moved across the face at eye level, lifted and carried by the wind rather than knocked loose by tools. Progress slowed. Every move required more balance, and every stop drained heat from hands and feet. The lead climber reached a small stance and started building the next anchor. Dexterity was already fading, and stopping too long risked losing the ability to work the hardware. Moving quickly meant trusting ice that had not been fully checked. An ice screw was placed near a seam in the wall, biting into what looked like solid ice. It seated firmly and held body weight without movement. What could not be seen was the thin layer beneath it, formed by repeated freeze-thaw cycles and shaped by constant wind exposure. Arthur moved toward the anchor with his body kept close to the wall to limit side pull. The rope system was fully loaded and committed, with no slack to absorb sudden force. By that point, the group had passed the last practical place to reverse the climb. Retreat would have required dismantling anchors under worsening wind while suspended on steep terrain. Another gust came through, stronger than the last, striking the wall from the side and loading the rope and anchor at the same time. The rope tone changed as tension spiked. That surge was enough to overwhelm what the ice could hold. The system shifted from stable to unstable in a moment, removing the remaining margin the group had been relying on. The wind surged through the ravine in a single, violent push. Climbers nearby later described it as strong enough to force them flat against the ice, momentarily overpowering balance and footing. Arthur was on the wall when it hit, mid-move, having just shifted his weight upward onto the rope system he had set. The timing mattered. As his feet unloaded and his full weight transferred to the anchor, the gust drove his body outward, adding a sudden sideways force to the line. The anchor failed instantly. The ice screw did not slowly creep or bend. The thin ice around it fractured, and the placement blew apart under the combined load of the wind and body weight. The rope went slack. Arthur's feet lost contact with the wall, and he was pulled outward before dropping below the anchor point. He struck the rock face almost immediately. The first impact twisted his body sideways, with his shoulder and helmet taking the hit against exposed granite. The helmet cracked but did not stop the rotation. A second impact followed moments later, harder, knocking his ice axe out of controlled alignment as his body continued to fall. As he dropped, the axe swung freely. Roughly 60 feet down, the pick caught against his chest as momentum carried him forward, driving it beneath the collarbone. From that point, there was no further coordinated movement. His body continued falling another 100 feet, before coming to rest on a snow-covered ledge below. Climbers above reported no signs of motion after the final impact. Above him, the rope came tight as the load transferred through the system. One climber was pulled hard into the wall and dropped to a knee. Another lost an ice tool when the rope snapped sideways, but remained clipped in. The sound of the anchor failure carried through the ravine, metal tearing free, rope striking ice, then faded under the wind. Helmet cameras from climbers higher on the route later showed the moment clearly. The anchor ripping out, the rope jerking, Arthur accelerating downward and disappearing from view. The audio captured only wind, impact, and then sustained gusts overpowering everything else. There was no shouting after that. The wind made it difficult to stay upright, let alone move. Snow began blasting through the ravine in sheets, flattening contrast, cutting visibility to less than 30 feet. The failed anchor sat above a steep section of wall with no alternate line around it. Arthur's last visible position was partly obscured by an overhang, intermittently visible through blowing snow. Reaching that spot would have required removing the remaining protection and committing another climber to the same exposure that had just caused the failure. The group stayed clipped in, focused on maintaining position as conditions worsened. Gusts came in sustained waves, strong enough to press bodies into the ice even while tethered. Ice began forming rapidly on ropes and hardware, increasing drag and making adjustments slow and awkward. Gloves stiffened. Fine motor control dropped. Communication broke down to brief gestures that were often missed as spindrift filled the air. As conditions worsened, the climb stopped being about upward progress and shifted into a struggle to hold position. One climber began shivering hard enough that his balance suffered. Another scraped repeatedly at the ice, unable to reset crampon points on the glazed surface. Wind pushed laterally through the ravine, stripping heat and flattening contrast until ice and rock blurred together. There was no shelter and no stable place to rest. When the group finally attempted to descend, the wind Arthur had said would ease was already established, and every option carried risk they no longer had the capacity to absorb. The first attempt to retreat stalled almost immediately. When Arthur set the rappel, the rope locked as soon as it was weighted. Ice had formed inside the anchor hardware, and the line would not feed. They worked it loose by hand, chipping and pulling until it moved again, but the delay cost time and heat. On the next attempt, a climber stepped onto the rope as a gust struck the wall. His feet slid. He swung outward and had to be hauled back to the stands. The recovery took several minutes and left the group slower and less coordinated than before. Arthur continued resetting anchors and changing rope angles as conditions worsened, treating each problem as a delay rather than a stop. Wind-driven ice began coating the wall in thin, fast-forming layers, dulling edges and filling the threads of screws and rings. Holds that had been usable minutes earlier turned slick and unreliable. Above them, the route tightened into steeper, more exposed ice where spacing mattered and pauses carried consequence. Below them, the descent demanded clean foot placements and steady balance on terrain that no longer allowed correction. Each anchor took longer to build. Each transition burned more time and strength. Communication narrowed to hand signals and brief nods, many of which were missed or misunderstood as spindrift swept across the wall. The first clear sign of failure came without noise or movement. One climber, clipped in close to the wall, stopped responding to signals. His posture sagged forward, helmet resting against the ice, harness fully weighted. His hands remained on his tools, but they no longer moved. When another climber reached him and adjusted his stance, there was no reaction. The wind swallowed any sound. His position did not change. They attempted to continue past him. During the next descent setup, another climber transferred weight onto the rope as a gust struck the wall. The force pushed him sideways before his feet could set. He swung hard into the ice, striking shoulder first, then his helmet. Before the rope snapped tight, the anchor held under the load. His body went slack immediately. When he was pulled back to the stance, he did not assist or resist. His weight hung dead in the harness. From that point on, the system stopped functioning as a unit. Lines froze where they lay. Anchors jammed as ice filled moving parts faster than it could be cleared. Spacing between climbers increased as each adjustment took longer to complete and required more effort. Arthur attempted to reorganize the sequence, shifting positions and reassigning movement, But the wall no longer allowed clean transitions. The remaining climber tried a different option, moving upward instead of down, angling toward a section of wall that looked slightly less exposed to the wind. He gained only a few meters. Ice had glazed the surface, turning what should have been secure placements into a smooth skin over rock. Spindrift poured through the ravine in sheets, cutting visibility down to shifting gray. When he reached for his next step, his crampon failed to bite. It skated across the ice, and his weight moved past the point he could recover. He fell backward into open space. The rope caught him, but the arrest was violent. His body slammed into the wall, swung outward, then struck again as the line snapped tight under load. Witnesses lower in the ravine later described the impact as sudden and heavy, the kind that leaves no room for controlled movement afterward. He remained conscious only briefly, long enough for his hands to move, grasping at air and ice without coordination, before going still. He was left hanging in place as wind continued to drive ice across the route, the rope slowly stiffening as it froze. Investigators later noted that from that point on, the system was effectively locked. The ropes hardened into rigid lines, anchors iced over and could not be reset. No climber could move without risking another uncontrolled fall. There was no sudden spike in weather and no unexpected collapse of terrain. Conditions continued to worsen exactly as forecast, tightening the ravine minute by minute. What remained on the wall was not an active rescue scenario, but a frozen sequence. Bodies held in place by gear that could no longer be adjusted, in a storm that never needed to surprise anyone to finish what had already been set in motion. We cover more climbing disasters like this. Consider subscribing if you want to see how trusted decisions on the mountain can turn routine ascents into fatal chains of failure. By early afternoon, rescue coordination began at lower elevations, but conditions in the ravine exceeded safe limits. Ground teams staged and waited, monitoring wind speeds as they climbed past operational thresholds. Helicopter crews prepared and stood down repeatedly as turbulence tore through the upper mountain. Rotor wash would have destabilized snow and ice in the ravine, making aerial insertion unsafe even if visibility improved. Snowfall began filling ledges and coating anchors, erasing any remaining margin for entry. As daylight faded, Huntington Ravine held 4 climbers at different heights along the route, connected by frozen ropes and immobile anchors. Each climber ultimately fell between roughly 150 and 220 feet over the course of the failure sequence. These were not clean drops. Based on injury patterns observed during recovery, each fall involved repeated impacts, ice, rock, and compacted snow, redirecting bodies and increasing injury with every strike. Helmets reduced surface damage, but could not absorb the cumulative force. Ice tools tore loose during rotation, causing penetrating injuries. Packs shifted violently, altering balance mid-fall. Rope segments snapped free and recoiled uselessly behind them. Rescue leaders classified the situation as active but unreachable. Sending teams into the ravine under those conditions would have meant adding more climbers to the same wall, facing the same failures. No attempt was made that night. When conditions finally eased the following morning, teams were able to enter the ravine on foot. Even then, progress was slow and methodical. Wind had scoured the upper walls overnight, leaving sections of hard, brittle ice layered over older snow. Every anchor was approached cautiously, tested by hand, before any weight was committed. Ice had to be chipped out of rings and carabiners before ropes could move. Rescuers advanced one at a time, spacing themselves to limit exposure as spindrift continued to sweep intermittently through the gully. The first climber was found still upright against the wall, clipped into the rope exactly where he had stopped the day before. His harness was fully weighted, his helmet pressed into the ice, his boots planted unevenly on a narrow stance. There were no signs of movement around his feet or tools, no scuffing, no repositioning. The rope above and below him was frozen solid, locked into the anchor by ice that had formed overnight. His posture suggested he had remained in place as conditions deteriorated, held there until injury and exposure ended all movement. Farther down the route, Arthur Brooke was located on a narrow ledge beneath a shallow overhang. His body was angled downhill, one knee bent beneath him. the other extended awkwardly toward open space. The snow around him showed shallow, irregular scrapes, short drags and partial slides, rather than the disturbance pattern of a long fall. His ice axe was still secured to his wrist, the pick buried lightly in the surface where it had last been driven in. There was no evidence of a secondary anchor or an attempted reset. Everything around him suggested a brief effort to stabilize, followed by loss of strength rather than sudden impact. The remaining climbers were found at separate points along the line of descent. One was suspended several feet off the wall, held in place by a frozen rope that had locked during a fall. The rope had cut a narrow groove into the ice where it had loaded under force. Another lay below a failed placement, his body positioned at the base of a steep step where the wall steepened abruptly. Their injuries were consistent with high-energy swings into the wall, blunt force combined with penetration from ice tools and crampon points, followed by prolonged exposure once movement stopped. Recovery took 2 full days. Teams rebuilt anchors one section at a time and freed ropes that had frozen solid into the ice overnight. Each body was lowered in controlled stages before equipment was removed and logged at safer ground. Inside Arthur Brooks' pack, rescuers found printed forecasts and saved phone screenshots showing earlier updates that suggested lighter winds and a possible clearing. Later advisories warning of extreme gusts were absent. Investigators concluded that Arthur, acting as the guide, had relied on that earlier information when deciding to proceed, a choice that set the group's timing and committed them to terrain with no clean exit once the storm arrived. Medical examiners determined that all 4 climbers died from catastrophic traumatic injuries sustained during falls and violent swings into the ravine walls, compounded by exposure. The injuries occurred at different points along the descent, but none were survivable. Based on fracture patterns and internal damage, loss of consciousness would have followed within seconds. There were no signs of prolonged struggle or delayed death. The outcome was sealed not by a single failure on the wall, but by the sequence that placed the group in that position when conditions deteriorated. The investigation found no unexpected weather event. The storm followed the forecast that had been issued before the climb began. Winds rose as predicted, ice loaded the ravine as warned, and visibility collapsed on schedule. What changed that morning was the information the group acted on. Arthur told them conditions were improving, and they trusted him as their guide. Each step deeper made reversal harder, until continuing felt safer than turning back. By the time the truth became unavoidable, retreat was no longer realistic. The climb ended not because the mountain behaved unpredictably, but because one decision removed every safer option that followed, and the ravine closed around it. It was May 15th, 2016, and the morning air at Camp 2 on Mount Everest's western CWM held the sharp bite of -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp sat just over 21,200 feet on the broad glacial valley between the towering walls of Nuptse to the west and Lhotse to the east. Tents dotted the uneven ice in clusters organized by expedition companies, their bright fabrics creating patches of color against the monochrome landscape. Prayer flags strung between camps snapped in the wind, carrying mantras across the thin air. Among the climbers staged at Camp 2 was Derek Holden, a 38-year-old from Vancouver, British Columbia. Derek had made his fortune in commercial real estate development, selling a portfolio of properties 3 years earlier for an amount he described as substantial to anyone who asked. The sale had funded what he called his transformation, a shift from corporate life to adventure pursuits that could be documented and shared. He had taken up mountaineering 18 months before arriving at Everest, completing guided ascents of Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Aconcagua. His Instagram following had grown from 300 to nearly 12,000 during that period, built on aspirational content that positioned him as someone pursuing authentic experiences at the edges of human capability. Derek's approach to climbing emphasized personal narrative over technical development. He trained in a gym near his home but had limited experience with actual mountaineering skills. His ascents had been guided trips where logistics were managed entirely by support staff, allowing him to focus on the physical effort and the content creation that documented it. Everest represented the culmination of that narrative, Derek had paid more than $70,000 to join a commercial expedition operated by a mid-tier guiding company based in Kathmandu. The fee covered permits, Sherpa support, oxygen supplies, and logistics from base camp to the summit and back. His social media content from the expedition had been consistent. Daily posts framing his presence on Everest as evidence of mental toughness and commitment. Above Camp 2, the Lhotse face reared up in a continuous blue ice wall. Teams of Sherpas had been working on that face for 2 weeks, installing the ropes that would carry hundreds of climbers toward the summit during the narrow weather windows of late May. The work required spending hours in exposed positions, drilling ice screws into surfaces that could fracture without warning, testing each anchor under body weight, before trusting it with the loads it would bear. The climbing season was entering its critical phase. Weather forecasts predicted a stable high-pressure system would arrive within days, opening the first legitimate summit window. Expedition leaders were finalizing rotation schedules. Oxygen caches were being positioned at higher camps, and the tension of accumulated preparation was becoming tangible across the mountain. What Derek's post did not include were the Sherpas who made his ascent possible. When they appeared in his photos, carrying his equipment, preparing his meals, setting up his tent, they were rarely identified by name. On the occasions when he did mention them, it was in passing references to my Sherpa or the porters, language that reduced individuals to functional roles. This pattern had been noted by other climbers at base camp, but in an environment where dozens of expeditions operated independently, such behavior rarely prompted direct confrontation. Derek's relationship with his assigned Sherpa support team had been deteriorating since the expedition began. His lead Sherpa was Dorje Tamang, 34, a veteran of 11 Everest summits who had worked in high-altitude guiding for 15 years. Dorje had been raised in the Kumbu Valley, learned mountaineering from his father, and supported his extended family with income earned during the climbing season. He was known among expedition companies as reliable, patient, and skilled at managing the personality types that high-altitude mountaineering attracted: the insecure, the arrogant, the terrified, the overconfident. The first significant incident occurred during the initial acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet. Derek had insisted on filming inside the Kumbu icefall, despite being told repeatedly that many Sherpas considered the icefall a sacred space where cameras were inappropriate. The icefall was where most Sherpa deaths occurred on Everest, a constantly shifting maze of ice blocks and crevasses that had to be crossed multiple times during each expedition. Sherpas had lost friends, brothers, and fathers in that section, and the cultural practice was to move through it quickly and respectfully, without treating it as a backdrop for content creation. When Dorje explained this during a rest stop between the ladder crossings, Derek responded that he had paid for full access and would document whatever he chose. He continued filming, capturing footage of Sherpas moving loads through the most dangerous sections of the icefall. That footage later appeared in a video post describing the chaos and disorganization he had observed, with no mention of the cultural context Dorje had tried to explain. The post received hundreds of comments praising Derek's bravery and thanking him for showing the reality of Everest. None of the commenters knew they were watching footage that had violated protocols Dorje had explicitly outlined. The second incident occurred at Camp 2 during a rest day. Derek had been editing photos on his laptop inside the mess tent when Dorje entered to discuss the next day's plan. Without looking up, Derek asked Dorje to bring him coffee. The request itself was not unusual. Sherpas regularly prepared food and beverages for clients as part of expedition logistics, but the manner was dismissive, delivered as an order rather than a request, and several other Sherpas in the tent had witnessed the exchange. The tone carried implications about hierarchy and value that extended beyond the immediate interaction. Dorje prepared the coffee without comment, but the incident circulated through the Sherpa community at base camp within hours, adding to a growing file of observations about Derek's behavior. The third incident involved a social media post that reached Sherpas through clients who followed Derek's account. He had uploaded a photo of himself at Camp 2 with the Lhotse face visible behind him, captioned with text describing his progress as a personal achievement built through months of training and mental preparation. The post made no reference to the Sherpas who had carried 70% of his equipment to that altitude, established the camp infrastructure, or fix the ropes visible in the background of his photo. Climbers who knew Dorje's team later said this post caused significant anger, not because it omitted credit, but because it actively erased their labor from a narrative that depended entirely on their work. By early May, Derek's behavior had become a topic of conversation among Sherpa teams across multiple expeditions. The Sherpa community on Everest operated as an interconnected network where information traveled quickly and reputations were tracked across seasons. Guides who worked for competing companies often trained together, shared equipment, and coordinated rescue efforts. Within that network, Derek was developing a reputation as someone who demonstrated consistent disrespect, not through single dramatic acts, but through accumulated patterns of behavior that revealed how he understood his relationship to the people supporting his climb. The triggering event occurred on the morning of May 15th. Derek had climbed to approximately 23,000 feet on the Lhotse face the previous day as part of his final acclimatization rotation before the summit push. The climb had been exhausting. 3 hours of front pointing up ice while clipped to fixed ropes, pausing every few steps to gasp for breath in air that held barely 40% of sea level oxygen. He descended back to Camp 2 in the early afternoon, exhausted but satisfied with his progress. His legs trembled from the effort, and his fingers were numb despite insulated gloves. That evening, after warming himself in his sleeping bag and forcing down a freeze-dried meal, he posted a photo of himself on the fixed ropes with a caption describing the technical difficulty of the climbing and his growing confidence in his abilities. The post included a sentence stating that he had installed sections of rope himself to ensure proper placement after observing questionable anchors on the lower face. This statement was false. Derek had not installed any ropes. The work had been done entirely by Sherpa rope-fixing teams over the previous 2 weeks, with each team member spending 8 to 10 hours per day drilling anchors, hauling coils of rope up the face, and testing placements under load. But the claim appeared on his account, where thousands of followers read it, liked it, and left comments praising his thoroughness and technical skill. By morning, the post had been screenshot and shared among Sherpas at Camp 2 through a WhatsApp group used for coordinating logistics. The reaction was immediate and intense. Derek had not merely failed to credit their work, he had explicitly claimed it as his own. To the Sherpas who had spent nearly 2 weeks fixing lines up a face that rises well over 3,000 vertical feet, hauling coils of rope, drilling anchors, and trusting their lives to every placement, the lie represented a fundamental violation. It was not simply disrespectful, it was theft of identity and erasure of accomplishment. What happened next unfolded with a speed that suggested the response had been building for weeks. Around 9 in the morning, Sherpas began descending from higher camps. They came from the Lhotse face, from Camp 3, around 23,500 feet, from advanced positions where they had been pre-positioning equipment for the summit push. They moved down the fixed ropes in groups, unclipping and reclipping past each anchor point with practiced efficiency. Clients and Western guides watched them pass, initially assuming some logistical issue had prompted a temporary evacuation. By 10:30, more than 60 Sherpas had gathered at Camp 2. They congregated near the center of the camp in an open area between expedition clusters, speaking in Nepali with raised voices and animated gestures. Other climbers began to notice the gathering, and word spread quickly that something unusual was happening. Several expedition leaders approached to ask what was happening and were firmly told that the matter concerned only the Sherpa community and the Canadian climber. They were instructed not to involve themselves. Derek became aware of the situation when Dorje arrived at his tent shortly before 11. Dorje's expression was controlled, but his message was direct. The Sherpa community wanted to speak with him about his social media post. Derek needed to come out and address what he had written. Derek responded that he was resting and would talk later. Dorje repeated the request with greater emphasis, explaining that the situation was serious and delay would make things worse. Derek told him to leave and closed the tent vestibule. Within minutes, the gathering of Sherpas moved toward Derek's tent. What had been 60 men became 80, then over 100 more descended from the Lhotse face and arrived from other sections of Camp 2. They formed a loose circle around Derek's tent at a distance of roughly 30 feet, a cordon that effectively isolated him from the rest of the camp. Several Sherpas carried ice axes, not raised as weapons, but held in ways that communicated readiness. The atmosphere had shifted from anger to something colder and more organized. The sun beat down on the western CWM, the basin turning into its familiar heat trap, air temperatures climbing toward the upper 20s, with the glare making it feel warmer than it had any right to at 21,300 feet. But the cold radiating from the circle of men had nothing to do with temperature. Melissa Grant, an American guide camped approximately 50 yards away, later described the scene as unlike anything she had witnessed in 12 years of Everest expeditions. The Sherpas were not shouting or threatening violence. They were simply standing in formation, waiting. The silence was more disturbing than the noise would have been. It communicated control and collective purpose. Other climbers had emerged from their tents to watch, standing in small groups at safe distances. At approximately 11:15, Derek emerged from his tent. He appeared confused by the number of people surrounding him and asked what was happening. The response came from multiple Sherpas, simultaneously, delivered in English for his benefit. He had lied about the rope work. He had stolen credit for their labor. He had disrespected their community repeatedly over weeks. They wanted a public acknowledgement and apology. Derek's response escalated the situation. He stated that his post had been misunderstood, that he had not claimed to install all the ropes, only to have checked them for safety. When several Sherpas read the exact text of his caption back to him from their phones, he shifted to arguing that social media posts were personal expression and not subject to their approval. He added that he had paid substantial fees for their services and expected them to fulfill their contracted obligations without harassment. The words hung in the thin air, and the circle of Sherpas contracted slightly, an unconscious collective movement that reduced the space around Derek by several feet. The surrounding circle tightened further. Sherpas moved from 30 feet to 20 feet, then closer. Derek backed against his tent, looking around for support from other climbers or expedition staff. Several Western guides had positioned themselves at the edge of the confrontation, but made no move to intervene. Later interviews revealed their calculation. Derek had created the situation through his own actions, and inserting themselves into a dispute between him and the Sherpa community could damage their own relationships with teams they depended on for future expeditions. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. What happened next remains disputed in detail, but clear in outcome. Derek attempted to retreat back into his tent. Several Sherpas moved forward to prevent this, and physical contact occurred. Derek shoved one Sherpa backward. That Sherpa stumbled but did not fall. Immediately, others surged forward. Hands grabbed Derek's jacket and arms. He was pulled away from his tent and dragged toward the center of the circle. He shouted for help, calling out to other climbers by name, but no one moved. The violence lasted approximately 90 seconds. Derek was struck in the face and body multiple times. He fell to his knees on the ice. When he tried to stand, he was kicked and fell again. Blood appeared on his face from a cut above his eye. His jacket tore at the shoulder seam. One of his gloves came off and disappeared into the crowd. Then, as quickly as it had started, the physical assault stopped. The Sherpa stepped back, reforming the circle. Derek remained on his knees, gasping in the thin air. His face was swelling on the left side where he had been struck. His breathing was rapid and shallow, each inhalation producing a whistling sound. At 21,300 feet, where oxygen saturation was already critically low, the physical exertion and stress of the beating had pushed his system into acute distress. His hands shook as he pressed one palm against the ice to steady himself. What the Sherpas demanded next was simple. Derek needed to leave the mountain immediately, not after resting, not after discussing with his expedition leader, not after collecting his equipment. Now, they would give him 1 hour to pack essential items and begin descending. If he was still at Camp 2 after that time, they would return and finish what they had started. The threat was delivered calmly, without shouting, which made it more credible. Derek managed to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. He staggered back toward his tent, supported briefly by a Western climber who had finally approached. Inside his tent, Derek assessed his condition. His face was damaged, but not severely. The cut above his eye had stopped bleeding, leaving a dark crust across his eyebrow. His ribs ached on his left side, but he could breathe without sharp pain. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, though whether from cold, adrenaline, or altitude was unclear. His oxygen saturation, if measured with the pulse oximeter in his medical kit, would have shown levels well below safe thresholds. His judgment was already compromised by hypoxia, stress, and the cognitive impairment that accompanies extreme altitude. He made the decision that killed him. rather than descending slowly with support, rather than waiting for assistance from his expedition company, rather than coordinating with other climbers. Derek chose to flee immediately and alone. His thinking was likely influenced by hypoxia, fear, and the ultimatum he had received. In his impaired state, the safest option seemed to be immediate retreat to lower altitude where he could think more clearly and plan his next moves. He packed a small day pack with minimal supplies, a water bottle, energy bars, his phone, his wallet, and a down jacket. He left most of his equipment in the tent, including his sleeping bag, stove, and additional oxygen bottles. At noon, he started down the western CWM toward Camp 1. The route between Camp 2 and Camp 1 ran roughly 2.5 miles across the western CWM, gentle in angle, but cut through a maze of hidden slots and snow bridges. Under normal conditions with proper pacing, the trek required roughly 2 hours. The glacier was heavily crevassed, and the route wound between ice blocks and across snow bridges marked by wands. Visibility was excellent. Climbers typically traveled this section clipped to a rope team or within sight of others, since a fall into a crevasse without companions meant almost certain death. Derek descended alone, moving faster than his body could sustain at that altitude. His oxygen saturation continued to drop with exertion. His coordination deteriorated as his brain struggled to function on inadequate oxygen. His vision narrowed, reducing his peripheral awareness. His thoughts became fragmented and difficult to hold. He fixated on distance and speed, checking his watch repeatedly, trying to calculate how long it would take to reach safety. Around 12:40, approximately 1 mile below Camp 2, he stepped onto a snow bridge that appeared solid but had been weakened by afternoon warming. The surface temperature had risen into the teens, and the snow that had been frozen solid at dawn was now soft and unstable. The bridge collapsed beneath his weight without warning. One moment, he was walking on what appeared to be solid ground. The next moment, he was falling through empty air. Derek fell 23 feet into a crevasse before his body wedged between the narrowing walls of blue ice. The impact was catastrophic. His left femur was fractured mid-shaft, the bone breaking cleanly under the force of deceleration. Several vertebrae in his lower spine cracked, though the spinal cord remained intact. His head struck the ice wall, opening a gash across his scalp and leaving him momentarily unconscious. He remained wedged between the crevasse walls, his body held in place by friction and the narrowing slot that prevented him from falling deeper. When consciousness returned, Derek could not move. His broken leg sent waves of pain through his body with every attempted motion. His back would not respond to commands. His arms were pinned against the ice walls in positions that allowed minimal range of movement. Above him, he could see the ragged opening through which he had fallen, a slash of bright sky perhaps 15 feet overhead. His day pack, which had been torn from his back during the fall, lay on a ledge 12 feet above him, visible but completely unreachable. The pack contained his radio and emergency beacon. He tried to shout, but the thin air in his damaged body produced only weak sounds. The temperature inside the crevasse was well below zero, insulated from direct sunlight. Derek was dressed for active movement, not for lying motionless on ice. His body began losing heat immediately, conducted away through contact with surfaces that existed at temperatures far below freezing. He was discovered 3 hours later by a pair of Sherpas descending from Camp 2 with equipment. They spotted his pack on the ledge, investigated, and found him wedged in the crevasse below. They attempted to communicate, but received no coherent response. Derek was hypothermic and in hemorrhagic shock, skin waxy, breathing shallow, awareness flickering in and out as his body tried to compensate for blood loss and cold. His core temperature had dropped into the low 90s, and his body had begun shutting down non-essential functions to preserve heat for vital organs. A rescue operation formed in minutes, but the geometry made everything slow. The crevasse narrowed where Derek was wedged, too tight for 2 people to work side by side, and too unstable to risk forcing him downward. 6 Sherpas drilled ice screws into hard blue ice above the lip, equalized anchors, and built a compact pulley. One rescuer was lowered just far enough to reach Derek's chest and shoulders, working by feel in the confined slot, to thread webbing high under his arms. Then the team hauled in short, controlled increments, stop, reset, haul, his body scraping ice as they fought the pinch points all the way to daylight. By the time they brought him to the surface, his core temperature had dropped to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and he was no longer responsive to stimuli. Derek Holden was carried to Camp 1 above the icefall and staged for evacuation while the light held. When conditions allowed, a helicopter extracted him from lower on the route where aircraft performance was safer and flew him to Kathmandu for emergency surgery. He died during surgery shortly after midnight on May 16th. The official cause of death was listed as traumatic injuries, complicated by severe hypothermia and cerebral edema. He was 38 years old. The incident prompted investigations by Nepalese authorities and climbing organizations. Witness statements were collected, but no charges were filed. Reviews concluded that Derek's death resulted from his decision to descend alone while injured and impaired by altitude, not from the confrontation itself. Within the mountaineering community, it became known simply as the Camp 2 incident, discussed in forums and cited in briefings as a reminder of how quickly judgment can fail at altitude. The Sherpas returned to work within days. The season moved on, and Everest filled again with climbers chasing the same summit Derek never reached. It was May 17, 2016, at Everest Base Camp. Snow had been falling intermittently for 3 days, coating the tent village in a fresh layer of white that muffled sound and shortened visibility to a few hundred feet. Overnight, temperatures dropped into the teens, cold enough to freeze water bottles solid, while daylight warmed the camp just enough that climbers moved between tents without full layering. The season was entering its critical window. Weather forecasts suggested a summit opportunity would open within the week, and expedition teams were finalizing their rotation schedules and oxygen allocations. Among the climbers preparing for the push was Walter Brennan, a 68-year-old retired orthopedic surgeon from Boulder, Colorado. He sat in the dining tent of his expedition company, studying a laminated map of the Lhotse face while nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, traced the route with the familiarity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading topographic lines. The other climbers in the tent were decades younger, most in their 30s and 40s, and they deferred to Walter with a respect that bordered on reverence. He was the eldest member of the expedition by nearly 20 years, and his resume demanded acknowledgement. Walter had begun climbing in 1966 at age 18 on the granite walls of El Dorado Canyon outside Boulder. By his mid-20s, he had established first ascents in the Tetons and completed technical routes in the Canadian Rockies that remained test pieces decades later. His medical career had taken him away from serious mountaineering during his 30s and 40s, but he had returned to the high peaks after his children left for college, systematically working through objectives he had dreamed about during long shifts in the operating room. Denali in 2003, Aconcagua in 2007, Cho Oyu in 2011, Manaslu in 2014. Each summit had required months of preparation and careful acclimatization, and each had reinforced his belief that age was a number, not a limitation. Everest was the last entry on a list he'd carried for decades. Every other mountain had been crossed off. Only Everest remained. His wife Eleanor had died of pancreatic cancer 14 months earlier. In the months that followed, Walter trained with an intensity that unsettled his adult children, part grief, part purpose. Eleanor had always believed he would stand on Everest one day. Finishing the climb without her felt like the only way to carry her with him. The expedition company accepted his application with minimal hesitation. On paper, Walter was experienced, fit, and fully paid. Their screening process measured credentials and capability, not the quiet deterioration of age or the psychological weight of climbing through grief. The lead Sherpa assigned to Walter's team was Mingma Dorje, 34 years old, with 11 Everest summits, and a reputation for quiet competence. He had guided clients of varying abilities for 8 seasons, developing an intuitive sense for which climbers possessed the reserves necessary for the summit and which were operating on borrowed time. He rarely voiced these assessments directly. The expedition companies did not pay for opinions. They paid for logistics, rope fixing, load carrying, and the steady presence that kept clients moving upward. Judgments about client capability were made silently and acted upon only when circumstances forced the issue. Mingma first observed Walter on the trek from Lukla. Steady pace, controlled breathing, the calm efficiency of someone comfortable in the mountains. But the recovery was slower than it should have been. After steep sections, Walter needed longer pauses than he wanted to admit, and his appetite thinned early. These observations accumulated without being shared. Mingma mentioned nothing to the expedition leader or the other Sherpas, though he suspected they were making similar calculations. The system did not reward early warnings about paying clients. The concerns stayed internal, filed away until circumstances forced the issue. The acclimatization rotations began on May 5th, Camp 1 and back, then Camp 2 overnight, followed by a brief touch of Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, before returning to base camp to rest. Walter completed the first rotation without incident. He moved more slowly than the younger climbers, but his pace was consistent, and his condition upon return was acceptable. He ate dinner, slept 8 hours, and reported feeling strong the following morning. The expedition medic, a Nepali doctor contracted by the company, checked his oxygen saturation and found it within normal ranges for the altitude. There was no medical basis for concern. The second rotation revealed the first cracks. The climb to Camp 2 required crossing the Kumbu icefall in pre-dawn darkness, navigating the labyrinth of crevasses and unstable seracs, an objective hazard that has claimed plenty of lives over the decades. Walter's pace through the icefall was significantly slower than during the approach, his movements deliberate to the point of hesitation. At ladder crossings, he paused longer than other climbers, testing each step before committing his weight. The climbers behind him waited without complaint, but the delays were noted. Mingma climbed directly behind Walter through the icefall, close enough to assist if needed. He watched the older man's crampon placement, the way his legs trembled slightly on the steeper sections, the increasing frequency of his rest stops. At the top of the icefall, where the route flattened into the western CWM, Walter sat down heavily on his pack and did not move for nearly 10 minutes. His face was gray beneath his glacier glasses, and his breathing came in shallow gasps that took too long to normalize. Mingma offered water. Walter accepted it with a shaking hand and drank slowly. When he spoke, his voice was thin, stripped of the confident timbre it had carried at base camp. He mentioned that the altitude was taking its toll, that rest at Camp 2 would help. Mingma nodded without agreeing. He had heard similar reassurances from clients who never reached the summit and from clients who never came down. At Camp 2 that evening, Walter ate half a bowl of soup and disappeared into his tent. His absence was noted, but not questioned. At altitude, even warning signs often pass as routine. Mingma spoke quietly with Pasang Nuru, another experienced Sherpa assigned to the expedition, while the clients talked among themselves. The conversation was brief and conducted in Nepali, away from ears that might misunderstand. Mingma expressed his observation that the older American was deteriorating faster than expected. Pasang agreed. He had noticed the same patterns during the day's climb, the same warning signs that experience had taught them to recognize. They discussed what might happen if the deterioration continued. They did not discuss intervening. The decision to climb or descend belonged to the client, and ultimately, to the expedition leader. The Sherpas would do what they were paid to do. The third rotation was scheduled for May 12th. Walter rested at base camp for 4 days before the push, spending most of his time in his tent, reading and sleeping, and forcing himself to eat meals he did not want. He emerged for the climb, looking thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier, his cheekbones more prominent, the skin beneath his eyes darker and more hollow. The other climbers offered encouragement. Ian Whitfield reviewed the plan and confirmed that conditions looked favorable. No one suggested that Walter should reconsider. The ascent to Camp 3 required climbing the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice that rose roughly 2,300 vertical feet above Camp 2 at angles that often hovered around 40 degrees and steepened in sections. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained effort. Each step kicked into firm snow or ice, each pull on the rope drawing from reserves that altitude was steadily depleting. Strong climbers reached Camp 3 in 4 to 5 hours. Walter took nearly 8. Mingma stayed with him the entire way. He watched Walter stop every 50 feet to catch his breath, watched his crampon kicks grow weaker as the hours passed, watched the determination in his eyes harden into something that looked less like resolve and more like desperation. At one point, roughly 2/3 up the face, Walter's legs buckled without warning. He caught himself on the fixed rope, his Jumar locking against the downward force. But for a moment, he simply hung there, his body refusing to respond to commands his mind was still issuing. Mingma moved to his side and steadied him by the shoulder. He offered the option to descend, carefully and without judgment. Walter refused immediately. His jaw stayed clenched, his eyes fixed upslope, and his focus narrowed into something personal, less about the route and more about a promise he believed waited above. Mingma didn't know the name behind that promise yet, but he recognized the force driving it. He had seen grief push climbers before. It rarely pushed them anywhere good. They reached Camp 3 at 4:30 p.m., hours behind schedule. Walter collapsed into his tent and did not emerge for dinner. Mingma checked on him twice during the evening, finding him conscious but distant, wrapped in his sleeping bag with his breathing shallow. Walter had a small fingertip pulse oximeter in his kit. Most clients did, and he tried to get a reading with hands that were already cold and poorly perfused. The numbers jumped and stalled the way they often do at altitude, useless until Mingma had him warm his fingers and sit up long enough to breathe steadily. The best reading they could coax out of it was still ugly. Mingma didn't diagnose him out loud. He simply helped Walter seat the mask properly, check the regulator for ice, and if Walter was going to use oxygen at all that night, kept it within the plan they'd been given. Because at Camp 3, fine and not fine can look identical until it's too late. That night, while the wind battered the tents and the temperature dropped toward -20, Mingma made his assessment final. In his experience, the American was extremely unlikely to survive a summit attempt. His body was failing in ways that willpower could not override. The reserves that carried younger climbers through the death zone simply did not exist in a 68-year-old frame that had already given everything it had. The math was simple and merciless. The summit was still 5,500 feet above them. The death zone began in less than 3,000 feet. Walter had taken 8 hours to climb 2,200 feet of fixed rope. He would run out of time, oxygen, and strength long before he reached the top. Mingma shared this assessment with Pasang and with Dawatashi, a third Sherpa who would be part of the summit team. They listened without argument. They had reached the same conclusion independently. The question was what to do with the knowledge. The answer, unspoken but understood, was nothing. Walter was a paying client. He had signed waivers acknowledging the risks. He had the legal right to continue until he chose to stop or until conditions made continuation impossible. The Sherpas would accompany him as far as he could go. They would not force a decision he was unwilling to make. Hey, quick reminder, if stories like this hold your attention, where experience, ambition, and risk quietly collide, you can subscribe to see more. Your support keeps this channel going. Now let's get back to the mountain. The summit window opened on May 17th. Weather reports indicated a 36-hour period of reduced wind and clear skies, narrow but sufficient for teams staged at Camp 4 to make their attempts. Climbers who had been waiting for weeks began moving upward, a slow procession of colored suits against the white expanse of the Lhotse face. Walter was among them. He had rested at base camp for 3 days after the third rotation. Under the expedition medic's supervision, he did a couple of short, low-flow oxygen sessions and one brief run in a Gamo bag, the portable hyperbaric bag teams keep for serious altitude illness. A stopgap meant to buy rest, appetite, and sleep, not fix acclimatization. The intervention restored some color to his face and improved his saturation readings. When he emerged from his tent on the morning of the summit push, he looked better than he had in weeks. His voice was stronger. His movements were more fluid. Ian Whitfield noted the improvement and expressed confidence that Walter was ready. The observation was based on appearance rather than assessment. It was enough to justify proceeding. The climb from base camp to Camp 4 took 2 days, with an overnight at Camp 2. Walter moved slowly but steadily, pacing himself with the discipline of someone who understood that the real test lay ahead. He ate more than he had during previous rotations, forcing down calories his body needed, even when his stomach rebelled. He slept poorly, but slept, which was more than many climbers managed at altitude. By the time he reached Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet, he appeared to have stabilized. Camp 4 sat exposed on the South Col, wind-scoured and hostile even on good days. The summit window had delivered manageable wind, clear skies, the pyramid visible against the dark. Walter waited on low-flow oxygen while Mingma checked the equipment. The time for conversation had passed. What remained was execution. At 11:45 p.m., Mingma woke Walter and helped him prepare for departure. The older man moved stiffly, his joints protesting against the cold and the altitude, but he managed the familiar sequence of layering and buckling and checking without assistance. His oxygen mask was fitted and tested. His headlamp was activated and positioned. His harness was clipped to the fixed line that led up toward the triangular face. At 12:15, a.m. on May the 18th, Walter Brennan began his final climb. The first 2 hours went better than Mingma expected. Walter maintained a slow but consistent pace, his crampons finding purchase on the wind-scoured ice, his Jumar sliding up the rope with each deliberate step. The line of headlamps stretched above and below them, a vertical constellation of climbers, all moving toward the same invisible point. The cold was brutal, minus 30 degrees with wind chill, but Walter's layering held, and his extremities remained functional. He did not speak. He did not stop until the line stopped. He simply climbed. The balcony arrived at 3:40 a.m., a small platform at 27,600 feet, where climbers traditionally rested before the final push. Walter lowered himself onto a rock and sat motionless, his chest heaving, his head bowed forward. Mingma checked his oxygen supply and found it lower than optimal, the consumption rate elevated by the effort of the climb. He replaced the bottle with a fresh one, working quickly in the darkness, his fingers clumsy inside heavy gloves. Walter's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the climb. His movements became mechanical, and the coordination that looked normal at lower camps started to misfire in small ways. Fumbling his Jumar, taking a half-step sideways before correcting, pausing with his hand on the rope as if he'd forgotten what came next. When Mingma checked in, Walter's responses arrived late, sometimes several seconds behind the question, his brain struggling to keep pace with simple decisions. Pasang arrived at the balcony with another client and immediately moved to confer with Mingma. The conversation was brief and private, conducted while Walter sat unmoving on his rock. Pasang observed that the American was not going to make it. Mingma agreed. They discussed the turnaround time, the point at which they would be obligated to force a descent regardless of the client's wishes. The company protocol specified 1 p.m. as the latest acceptable summit time. Any later risked descending into darkness without adequate oxygen reserves. It was currently 3:45 a.m. The summit was approximately 4 hours away for a healthy climber. For Walter, it would take longer. The math remained unfavorable. The climb above the balcony steepened. The route traversed a ridge of mixed rock and ice, exposed on both sides to drops that disappeared into darkness. Walter's pace slowed further. He stopped every 30 steps, sometimes every 20, his body demanding rest that his mind refused to acknowledge. Other climbers passed them, moving with purpose toward the summit that was now tantalizingly close. They glanced at Walter as they passed. Some offered words of encouragement. Most said nothing. Everyone understood what they were seeing. At 6:15 a.m., as gray light began to illuminate the upper mountain, Walter stopped and did not immediately resume. He was standing on a narrow section of the ridge, his Jumar clipped to the fixed rope, his body swaying slightly in the wind. Mingma reached him within seconds and placed both hands on his shoulders to stabilize him. Walter's eyes were unfocused behind his glacier glasses. His breathing was rapid and shallow. When Mingma asked what was wrong, Walter did not respond. He simply stood there, staring at something no one else could see. This was the moment Mingma had been expecting. The altitude had finally overwhelmed the older man's compensatory mechanisms. His brain was starving for oxygen, his judgment compromised, his body running on reserves that had long since been depleted. A healthy climber would turn around immediately. Walter did not appear capable of making that decision. Mingma slowed his voice and reduced the problem to basics: time, oxygen, and the strength required to come back down. He repeated the key points until Walter's unfocused attention locked onto them. Then he gave the clearest off-ramp he could offer: descend now, while the margin still existed. Walter's response came slowly, as if dragged through fog. The summit was close enough that it had become an obsession. He fixated on the idea that stopping would make the entire expedition meaningless. He kept returning to the same thought, the same person, the same promise. Something waiting at the top that mattered more to him than the risk below his feet. Mingma looked to Pasang and saw the small head movement that confirmed what they both already knew. The decision was no longer theirs to influence. They continued upward. The next 2 hours were a slow-motion deterioration. Walter's steps became shuffles, his feet barely clearing the snow before setting down again. His rest stops extended to minutes, then longer. He fell twice, catching himself on the fixed rope each time, his body crumpling against the snow before struggling upright with Mingma's assistance. His oxygen consumption accelerated as his body fought to maintain function, the bottles draining faster than the careful calculations had assumed. At 8:30 a.m., approximately 400 feet below the summit, Walter collapsed and could not rise. He lay on the snow, his chest heaving, his eyes closed behind his fogged glasses. Mingma knelt beside him and checked his pulse. It was rapid and weak, the heartbeat of a body approaching its limits. He checked the oxygen supply. The current bottle was nearly empty. One bottle remained. Other climbers passed them on the descent, having summited earlier in the morning. They offered assistance that Mingma declined. 2 more bodies would not make the situation better. What Walter needed was lower altitude, warmer temperatures, and medical care that did not exist above 28,000 feet. What Walter needed was to have made a different decision hours ago. Mingma made the call that should have been made at the balcony. They were descending immediately. He communicated this to Walter, who did not respond, and to Pasang, who began preparing the older man for movement. Together they lifted Walter to his feet and clipped him to the rope between them. He would descend supported, his weight partially carried by the Sherpas, his movements guided by hands that had performed this service before. The descent began at 8:45 a.m. Progress was agonizingly slow. Walter's legs functioned intermittently, sometimes supporting his weight, sometimes giving way without warning. The Sherpas compensated as best they could, absorbing the stumbles, maintaining the forward momentum that was the only thing keeping their client alive. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose from deadly to merely dangerous. The wind remained manageable. Small mercies. At approximately 27,800 feet, roughly an hour into the descent, Walter's legs stopped working entirely. He slumped against the fixed rope, his full weight suspended by his harness, and the grip of the 2 Sherpas flanking him. His eyes were open but unseeing. His breathing had become irregular, with long pauses followed by shallow gasps. Mingma recognized the pattern. He had seen it before, in climbers whose bodies had simply given up. They tried to continue the descent. Carrying an unconscious man down technical terrain was theoretically possible, but practically devastating. Each step required coordination between 3 bodies, 2 of which were exhausted, and 1 of which was unresponsive. The fixed rope helped, providing a guide and an anchor, but the angle of the slope and the loose snow made every movement treacherous. After 20 minutes of struggle, they had covered less than 100 feet. At 10:15 a.m., at an altitude of approximately 27,650 feet, Walter Brennan stopped breathing. Mingma checked for a pulse at the neck and found nothing he could trust. No steady beat, no rhythm that returned when he waited and checked again. He cleared the mask, checked the airway the best he could through frozen straps and layers, and called Walter's name, loud then louder, as if volume could pull someone back. For a few seconds he tried compressions anyway, more reflex than logic, then stopped. On a narrow ridge at nearly 8,500 meters, CPR is almost always futile. Nothing changed. Walter's eyes stayed open, fixed on the blue sky above the ridge. They sat with him for several minutes. There was nothing else to do. The mountain had made its decision, and the decision was final. Walter had climbed as high as his body would allow, and then higher, driven by something stronger than survival instinct, chasing a summit that had never really been about the mountain at all. Mingma radioed base camp at 10:23 a.m., reporting the death and their position on the descent route. Ian Whitfield received the call with practiced calm, asked for details, logged the coordinates, and confirmed that recovery would be considered when conditions allowed. The body would likely remain where it was. Most bodies did. The Sherpas descended without their client, reaching Camp 4 by afternoon and base camp the next morning. The expedition absorbed the news with the muted grief common to high-altitude losses, sadness tempered by the understanding that everyone on the mountain had accepted this possibility. An investigation later cited high-altitude cerebral edema, complicated by exhaustion and age, and the company released a statement noting that all safety protocols had been followed. Mingma's earlier observations were not requested. In Walter's tent, among his personal effects, a weathered list of mountains was found, every name crossed off except Everest, beside which someone had added a short note in handwriting that wasn't his. The list was returned to his children with his wedding ring and photographs. They learned later that he had spoken often of their mother, that he had believed finishing the list would bring him closer to her, and that he had known the risks and accepted them. The mountain had not killed Walter Brennan. It had simply been the place where he chose to stop climbing. It was May 18th, 2016, just before dawn, at around 27,200 feet on Mount Everest's northeast ridge. Winds were unusually light, and from below, the summit appeared calm and cooperative, but weather data showed falling pressure and a storm system building beyond the Rongbuk Valley. with the jet stream expected to return later that day, a pattern later described by experienced climbers as a narrowing window rather than a sign of safety. However, 6 climbers were already committed to a summit push. One of them was Matthew Lee. Matthew Lee was 22 years old, but his path into climbing had been shaped by limits the others didn't face. His parents ran a small restaurant, and every trip required months of saving and careful planning. By that age, he had already spent summers guiding, where he learned how quickly routine climbs could turn dangerous when conditions shifted. He carried extra gear and backup supplies, not out of anxiety, but from experience. He had seen what happened when systems failed, and his pack was always heavier because he felt responsible for being ready, even when no one asked. On Everest, that pattern continued. He carried spare regulators, backup lights, medical supplies, and emergency insulation, quietly absorbing risk so others didn't have to. The rest of the team was the same age, but their relationship to the mountain was different. 5 of them had known each other since high school and had climbed together for years, fitting trips into weekends and school breaks. Everest had long been the shared goal at the center of those plans, discussed more as an achievement than a consequence. Matthew joined the group during their last year of school, initially because he had access to gear through a local climbing club and knew how to move efficiently in cold terrain. Over time, he became part of their rhythm. He didn't push the pace or dominate decisions. When conditions changed or someone fell behind, he slowed down and stayed with them, a steady presence that the group came to rely on without ever naming it. Even though they were the same age and had known each other for years, they approached climbing differently. Ryan Chen tended to lead on the approach, confident and competitive, always checking his watch against the plan. Alex Monroe talked through decisions verbally, weighing options out loud, often framing risk as something manageable if acknowledged. Chris Nolan relied on fitness, assuming his conditioning would compensate for uncertainty. Ethan Brooks prepared extensively on paper, memorizing routes and procedures without much time at extreme altitude. Jake Miller brought enthusiasm and loyalty, often deferring to whoever spoke last. That day's plan relied on shared oxygen supplies, fixed ropes, and a narrow schedule designed to get everyone below the summit by early afternoon. It was aggressive, but not unusual for Everest. The entire strategy depended on steady movement and smooth coordination, with the unspoken expectation that everyone would continue functioning as planned. At that altitude, even small failures can unravel quickly, and assumptions like that rarely last. Camp 4 sat at roughly 26,300 feet on a narrow platform gathering into the upper slopes below the northeast ridge. Space was limited, and tents were anchored directly to hard-packed snow and ice, with little protection from wind once it reached the ridge above. From this point, there was no gradual terrain. Every step upward led into sustained exposure, fixed ropes, and steep angles where balance mattered as much as strength. The summit push began at 2 a.m. Headlamps rose from the tents in a staggered line as climbers clipped into the fixed ropes and moved out into the darkness. The route immediately steepened, forcing climbers to lean into their harnesses while managing crampon placement on hard, wind-scoured snow. The temperature hovered near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to stiffen gloves, slow fine motor control, and drain batteries quickly. Supplemental oxygen made breathing possible at that elevation, but it did not reduce the physical effort. Every movement required deliberate coordination, and even simple tasks, clipping a carabiner, adjusting a mask, checking footing, took longer and demanded focus. Fatigue accumulated early, and there was no terrain ahead where the strain would ease. Matthew carried 2 extra oxygen bottles meant for the group. To balance the weight, he cut back on his own supply, dropping below what most guides would recommend. It was a choice he had made before on lower mountains, one that usually worked. Up here, the margin was much thinner. No one stopped to talk it through. As they climbed, the group spread out. The ridge narrowed in sections, forcing them into single file. Russian moved in front, setting a steady pace. The others followed without much discussion. Matthew stayed near the back, handling the extra weight and slowing whenever the ropes twisted or ice built up around the hardware, stopping to fix small problems before they turned into bigger ones. By around 4:30 a.m., the group was moving high on the northeast ridge, above Camp 4 and approaching the lower sections leading toward the first step. The sun was still below the horizon, but there was enough ambient light to trace the line of the ridge and the fixed ropes ahead. Wind remained light, almost unnaturally so for that elevation, and the calm encouraged continued movement. Nothing about the conditions signaled an immediate need to stop or reassess. As they climbed, Matthew's breathing became more labored. Supplemental oxygen helped, but the extra weight in his pack increased his demand faster than the others. He adjusted his flow rate, then adjusted it again, trying to compensate as the terrain steepened. The changes went unnoticed. The group stayed focused on timing and position on the route, measuring progress by altitude and minutes rather than by how each climber was holding up. At this altitude, decline rarely arrives in a clear or dramatic way. It shows up as small inefficiencies, a slower step, a longer pause, a moment of hesitation, the kind of signs that are easy to explain away as fatigue, especially when everyone wants to believe the plan is still holding. As they neared the first step, Matthew fell a little farther behind. He mentioned a headache and took a moment to readjust his mask before moving on. No one suggested turning back. From where they stood, the weather still looked stable, and the window still seemed open. This was where Everest's pressure began to narrow the group's thinking. Above 27,000 feet, even small decisions matter, whether they feel important or not. The body runs low on oxygen without making it obvious at first, and thinking becomes harder before physical strength is fully gone. At the same time, the way people act in a group starts to change. As the summit gets closer, responsibility doesn't get shared. It falls onto fewer people. They continued upward, driven less by the conditions around them than by the momentum already behind them. And by the time the mountain started to change, the system they were relying on had already pushed most of the risk onto one person, someone who had never learned how to step away when others depended on him. By the time the group reached the base of the second step, their margin had shrunk to minutes. The second step, at roughly 28,200 feet, is a short but demanding rock barrier that forces climbers to slow down and move in sequence. Fixed ropes provided a path upward, but balance and coordination still mattered. Even in good conditions, it created bottlenecks. That morning, several teams arrived at the same time. As they waited their turn, the wind began to change. The wind didn't hit all at once. It came in uneven pulses, short gusts that faded, then returned again, forcing climbers to tense up, ease off, and brace again without warning. Oxygen helped with breathing, but it didn't protect the mind. The strain showed in slower reactions and heavier focus. Matthew reached the second step several minutes behind the others and stopped longer than usual before clipping in. A climber from another team later told investigators that his headlamp was shaking as he tried to steady himself and that his movements looked deliberate but slow. When Matthew spoke, his voice was faint and his words came out uneven, and he mentioned feeling nauseous. At that altitude, nausea can be brushed off as fatigue, but investigators noted it is also a common early sign of serious brain swelling, one that should have triggered an immediate descent rather than continued movement. Ryan moved onto the route first, with Alex close behind, while Chris and Ethan followed in sequence. Jake stayed back with Matthew as he clipped in. Matthew paused longer than before, leaning forward until his helmet touched the rock. When he lifted his head, he blinked repeatedly, breathing hard in a way that didn't match the pace. A climber from a nearby team later told investigators that Matthew looked unsteady even before he left the ledge, his posture slack and his movements delayed. When Jake asked if he was okay, Matthew nodded but didn't speak. The line behind them continued to close, and no one wanted to stop and lose time or heat as the wind along the ridge picked up. As Matthew started climbing, his movement changed. On the latter section, his feet missed placements and his crampons scraped instead of setting cleanly. He clipped his ascender incorrectly twice and had to stop to fix it, forcing brief delays. Other climbers watching from below later described his motions as slow and uneven, the kind that signaled something more than fatigue. At that altitude, investigators noted, errors like these were early warnings, small signs that rarely stay small for long. By the time he reached the top of the second step, the change in him was obvious. He stopped and crouched forward, his helmet dipping as if he couldn't keep his head upright. He vomited into his oxygen mask, then fumbled with it, struggling to clear the regulator. His hands looked slow and uncoordinated, fingers stiff and unsure of what they were supposed to do next. He pulled the mask away to gulp cold air directly, then took several seconds to get it back in place. At that point, there was nothing unclear about what was happening. The headache, the vomiting, and the loss of coordination, later identified by medical reviewers as classic signs of high-altitude cerebral edema. It's a known risk on Everest, something every climber is warned about before arriving, and when it's caught early, it's usually survivable. The solution is straightforward. Descend immediately, increase oxygen, and give medication. What's harder is getting everyone to agree to stop. Matthew asked if they could slow down. He didn't say he had to stop, only that his headache was worsening and that his vision felt off. A climber from another team waiting nearby later told investigators that Matthew was standing still, unsteady but conscious, while the others talked among themselves. Ryan checked his watch and noted they were already behind schedule. Turning around meant abandoning the summit attempt, and that reality drove the discussion. One teammate argued that slowing down or descending would only push them into worse weather later. No one described Matthew's condition as a medical emergency. Witnesses said the conversation stayed focused on timing and exposure, while Matthew stood aside, waiting as the group decided to continue upward. Matthew stood back up without further argument. He adjusted his pack with unsteady hands and clipped back into the rope. From that point on, no witnesses reported any further discussion about stopping. Above 28,700 feet, the ridge narrowed and steepened. Fixed ropes angled sharply upward, forcing climbers to lean back into their harnesses to stay balanced. Wind arrived in uneven gusts, and cloud bands moved across the summit pyramid, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards at a time. Progress slowed as climbers paused for spacing on the line and braced during sudden wind shifts. Matthew's condition continued to decline. His speech became slurred and uneven, with delayed responses to simple questions. Climbers ahead later told investigators that his headlamp beam drifted off the route repeatedly, suggesting loss of coordination. Multiple witnesses reported noticing that one of his pupils appeared larger than the other. Medical reviewers confirmed this as a clear sign of rising intracranial pressure, consistent with advanced high-altitude cerebral edema. At that stage, deterioration can accelerate rapidly, and without immediate descent, collapse becomes increasingly likely even with supplemental oxygen. Despite these signs, the group continued upward. They moved in short pushes, stopping often, not to reassess, but to recover just enough to keep going. Each pause increased cold exposure. Each restart demanded more coordination than Matthew could reliably manage. There was no place on the ridge to stabilize or rest properly. By late morning, traffic increased near the upper ridge as several teams approached the summit. Climbers moving nearby later told investigators they noticed the group's uneven spacing and repeated stops. One climber reported seeing Matthew several steps behind the others, leaning forward and moving slowly, with pauses that lasted longer than normal for that altitude. They recalled the group stopping briefly to wait for him, then continuing upward almost immediately once he caught up, without visible discussion or adjustment to their pace. They reached the summit at around 11:30 a.m., well after normal turnaround times. Winds were already rising, clouds were moving in, and the descent still required hours of exposed travel. Investigators later noted that staying committed that late reduced the group's ability to respond when something went wrong. Matthew stood near the summit marker, but showed little reaction. He didn't raise his arms or engage with the cameras. In the photos taken there, his posture sagged forward, his face looked unfocused, and his breathing appeared poorly coordinated with his oxygen flow. Reviewers later said the images showed clear signs of serious neurological impairment, not someone capable of managing a descent on their own. Even so, the group did not treat the situation as urgent. The descent began shortly after noon, with the group moving one at a time along the fixed line. Roughly 200 feet below the summit, the ridge narrowed and steepened, forcing climbers onto hard, wind-scoured snow with patches of exposed ice. The slope angled sharply away on the downhill side, and the fixed rope ran slightly off-center, requiring careful foot placement and steady balance while clipped in. Matthew collapsed without warning. His knees gave way as he shifted weight to step down, and his body rotated sideways toward the fall line. Still clipped to the rope, he slid several yards over the hard surface, his crampon points skittering without biting. The slide stopped only when he managed to drive the pick of his ice axe into the slope, and tension came onto the rope. The arrest was uncontrolled, but effective enough to prevent a longer fall down the face. The slide itself did not appear violent enough to cause injury. There was no tumbling and no impact with rock, but when Matthew came to a stop, he remained down. He attempted to bring one knee underneath him, then the other, but could not coordinate the movement. His breathing was heavy and uneven. When he tried to speak, his words came out slow and incomplete, and his hands moved in small, uncertain motions, as if he were searching for balance that wasn't there. As the group gathered around Matthew, the ridge grew less forgiving by the minute. Wind swept across the slope in steady gusts, driving fine ice crystals into the air and flattening contrast so the surface blended into a uniform gray. Depth became harder to judge. Thin cloud bands moved through in waves, briefly obscuring the route before clearing again. The temperature continued to drop, and everything below them, every anchor, every traverse, every rope section, still lay hours away. The group did not settle in or attempt to stabilize him. They stopped briefly, then began redistributing equipment. Oxygen was already tight, and daylight was slipping. Climbers lower on the ridge later told investigators they watched the group pull in close, heads bent together, then begin separating almost immediately. There was no extended discussion and no visible effort to prepare Matthew for a descent. During that short pause, decisions were made. Matthew's remaining oxygen bottle was unclipped first, then his headlamp, then the spare insulation he had been carrying. Each item was taken cleanly and passed down the rope, redistributed among the others as they reorganized for the descent. From a distance, witnesses said it looked orderly and efficient, movements made with purpose, not panic. Matthew was still conscious while this was happening. Climbers watching from below reported seeing him lift his arms and turn his head as people moved around him. He reacted to touch. He tracked motion, but he could not stand, and he could not speak clearly enough to stop what was happening. When the group finished redistributing the gear, they clipped back into the fixed line one by one and began moving downhill, leaving Matthew seated on the slope with no oxygen, no light, and no extra protection from the cold. What remained behind was not confusion or chaos, but a cleared path downward, and a decision already carried out. One teammate stayed beside him slightly longer. A climber positioned lower on the ridge later told investigators that through binoculars, he saw someone crouch near Matthew and briefly place a hand on his shoulder. Matthew turned his head and attempted to respond, but his movements appeared slow and poorly controlled. Moments later, another climber called out from below, indicating the route down. The crouching climber stood, clipped back into the fixed line, and followed the others. Within minutes, the group resumed their descent, leaving Matthew alone on the slope. Matthew's helmet camera continued recording after he was left behind. The footage showed short, uneven attempts to move downhill, followed by long pauses with his head resting against the snow. At times, faint speech could be heard, fragmented remarks about pain, changes in vision, and difficulty moving his hands. Reviewers later noted the absence of panic or sudden confusion. His decline was gradual, not abrupt. Based on the footage and timeline, medical specialists concluded that when he was left on the ridge, his condition was still potentially survivable with immediate descent and basic care. The outcome was shaped less by weather or terrain than by the decision to keep moving. From a distance, the ridge did not go completely still. Climbers several hundred feet away later told investigators they could see Matthew moving intermittently, using his ice axe for balance and crawling short distances before stopping to rest. As the afternoon wore on, the wind increased, visibility dropped in cycles, and temperatures continued to fall. By the time another team reached his position, his condition had worsened. His body temperature was critically low and he did not respond to voice or touch. Supplemental oxygen was administered briefly, but there was no meaningful improvement. Meanwhile, Matthew's group had already reached lower camps and reported to base camp that he was presumed dead when they left. That account conflicted with multiple witness reports, which confirmed Matthew remained alive and attempting to move for hours afterward, a discrepancy investigators later identified as central to understanding how the decision to leave him behind was made while intervention was still possible. When teams passed back through the area the following day, Matthew was located approximately 200 feet below the point where he had first collapsed, still on the line of descent. He was positioned facing downhill with his ice axe secured in his hand. The snow around him showed shallow, uneven marks consistent with slow movement, short drags and partial slides, rather than the disturbance pattern left by a fall or avalanche. There were no signs of impact trauma, no broken equipment, and no debris field. The scene suggested he had continued trying to move on his own, gradually losing the ability to do so as his condition worsened. Investigators later noted that the physical evidence aligned closely with witness accounts from the previous afternoon. From a distance, Matthew had still been moving, and those movements left traces that ended where he was found. By the time climbers reached him again, the window for intervention had closed. A descending team confirmed there were no signs of life, documented the location, and relayed the information to base camp before retreating as weather along the ridge continued to deteriorate. The sequence underscored the gap between what was assumed from below and what was actually happening on the slope, movement that looked minimal from afar, but represented the last stages of a prolonged attempt to descend. Several weeks later, during a scheduled descent window, climbers passing through the area recovered Matthew's helmet camera. The device had been shielded from impact in extreme cold, and the memory card was intact. When investigators reviewed the footage, it provided a continuous record beginning shortly after the summit descent. By aligning timestamps and movement patterns, they reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. The video showed Matthew collapsing shortly after 12:15 p.m., with the rest of the group moving away within minutes. The footage then documented hours of continued consciousness, during which Matthew attempted to move downhill in short intervals. Medical reviewers identified early and progressive signs of high-altitude cerebral edema in the footage, including severe headache, repeated vomiting, loss of balance, slurred speech, uneven pupil response, and declining motor control. Matthew described pressure in his head, vision changes, and difficulty moving his hands and legs, consistent with advanced cerebral edema. The footage also showed worsening weather conditions, with increasing wind, falling temperatures, and visibility dropping as daylight faded. Witnesses from nearby teams later reported seeing Matthew move intermittently long after his group had descended. Investigators emphasized that his awareness declined gradually, not suddenly, indicating that while his condition was severe, it had not yet reached a stage where descent or assisted evacuation would have been impossible. The investigation found that Matthew Lee died from high-altitude cerebral edema, worsened by exposure, and that his condition was still treatable when he was left on the ridge. Helmet footage and witness accounts contradicted claims that he chose to stay behind, showing he remained conscious and attempting to move after his teammates descended. No criminal charges followed due to jurisdictional limits and the difficulty of proving intent, and civil actions ended without public accountability. Investigators reached a consistent conclusion. Matthew Lee did not die because rescue was impossible, but because forward momentum was allowed to override intervention. It was April 29th, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sprawled across the Kumbu Glacier at 17,600 feet under a crystalline morning sky. The temperature was held at 19 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exhaled breath hung visible in the thin air, but warm enough that climbers moved between tents without full expedition suits. The camp had swelled to nearly 800 people during the peak preparation window. Clients, guides, Sherpas, cooks, medical staff, and the support personnel required to sustain what had become a seasonal industry. Diesel generators hummed steadily, powering communications equipment and charging stations. Prayer flags stretched between clusters of tents, their colors vivid against the monochrome landscape of rock and ice. Among the arriving climbers was Chelsea Monroe, a 24-year-old from Los Angeles, whose TikTok account had grown from 12,000 followers to nearly 480,000 over the previous 14 months. Chelsea had built her audience through aspirational lifestyle content, luxury travel, fitness routines, motivational messaging about pushing boundaries and refusing to accept limitations. Her feed presented a curated narrative of transformation, positioning her as someone who had chosen adventure over comfort and achievement over complacency. The aesthetic was carefully constructed. Every post was color-graded for maximum impact, every caption workshopped for engagement, every location selected for its visual drama. Everest represented the apex of that narrative. Chelsea had announced the expedition 3 months earlier with a professionally produced video that featured training footage, sponsor acknowledgements, and emotional reflection about proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. The video generated 2 million views and 16,000 comments, most expressing admiration and support. What the video did not mention was that Chelsea's climbing experience consisted of a single, guided trek up Kilimanjaro completed 11 months earlier. She had no technical mountaineering training, no experience with fixed ropes or crampons, and no understanding of high-altitude physiology beyond what she had absorbed from YouTube videos and expedition blogs. Chelsea had paid $68,000 to join a commercial expedition operated by Summit Quest, a mid-tier guiding company that marketed itself as accessible to climbers with limited experience. The company's pitch emphasized support rather than prerequisites, promising that skilled Sherpas and Western guides would manage technical challenges while clients focused on endurance and determination. Chelsea's medical screening had been cursory, a questionnaire completed online, and a single video call with an expedition coordinator who asked whether she had any serious health conditions. When asked about previous climbing experience, Chelsea described Kilimanjaro in language that suggested more technical complexity than the mountain actually required. The coordinator accepted her application without further verification. Her assigned Sherpa was Pemba Nuru, 31, a climber from Forts Village who had summited Everest 7 times across 9 years of guiding. Pemba supported his parents, 2 younger sisters, and his own 3 children on income earned during the brief climbing season. He had learned to read clients quickly, assessing their fitness, their judgment, their capacity to follow instructions under stress. Within 2 days of meeting Chelsea at base camp, Pemba understood she was underprepared. She moved slowly during acclimatization hikes. Her breathing labored at relatively modest altitudes. Her questions revealed gaps in basic mountaineering knowledge. She asked whether crampons were required for the entire climb, whether she would need to carry her own oxygen bottles, and whether helicopter evacuation was available from the summit. But Chelsea's social media presence was seamless. Her TikTok posts from base camp showed her laughing with other climbers, completing yoga poses against mountain backdrops, and delivering inspirational messages about embracing fear and trusting the process. The videos were edited to emphasize confidence and capability. She posted training footage that had been filmed weeks earlier in Los Angeles, presenting it as current preparation. Her followers had no reason to doubt the narrative she was constructing. The comments sections were filled with encouragement, with strangers telling her she was brave, that she was inspiring them to pursue their own challenges. The first acclimatization rotation began on May 3rd. The route through the Kumbu icefall required navigating a chaotic maze of crevasses, ice blocks, and aluminum ladders that shifted daily as the glacier ground downslope at roughly 3 feet per day. The route gained approximately 2,000 vertical feet from base camp to Camp 1, with the worst hazards concentrated in sections where unstable seracs towered overhead and crevasses widened into slots that disappeared into blue shadow. Teams departed before dawn to minimize time in the danger zone, while the ice remained cold and stable. Chelsea struggled badly, the physical effort of ascending with crampons and a pack, the altitude sapping her strength, the exposure creating fear that slowed her movement. All of it combined into a grinding ordeal that required nearly 8 hours to complete a route that most clients finished in 4. Pemba stayed with her throughout, offering encouragement and managing her safety, but he could see that her body was not adapting to the altitude as it needed to. Her breathing remained rapid and shallow, even during rests. Her coordination was impaired, her foot placements uncertain. At one ladder, crossing over a particularly wide crevasse, she froze halfway across, paralyzed by the flex of the aluminum and the bottomless void below. Pemba had to talk her through each step, his voice calm and steady, while the rope team behind them waited with growing impatience. That evening at Camp 1, Chelsea posted a video that presented the climb as challenging but manageable, describing it as the hardest thing she had ever done, but emphasizing that her training had prepared her adequately. She did not mention the 8-hour duration or the moments of paralysis. She did not show the footage where Pemba had to physically guide her crampons onto ladder rungs. The video showed only her success, her determination, her smile as she raised a gloved fist toward the camera with Everest's upper slopes visible behind her. The post generated 43,000 likes and nearly 2,000 comments within 12 hours. The second rotation to Camp 2 revealed the same pattern. Chelsea moved slowly through the western Wm, the vast glacial valley that stretched for miles between the towering walls of Nuptse and Lhotse. The route crossed crevasse fields and traversed sections where the glacier's movement created unpredictable hazards. Chelsea required frequent rests, her face flushed despite the cold, her movements increasingly mechanical. After warming her hands inside his jacket and waiting for a stable reading, Pemba checked her oxygen saturation and found it at 69%, concerningly low, though not immediately dangerous. He explained that her body was struggling to acclimatize, that the numbers should be higher at this stage of the rotation schedule. He recommended additional rest days at base camp before attempting the next rotation to Camp 3. Chelsea's response was defensive. She insisted she felt fine, that the breathing difficulty was normal for this altitude, and that Pemba was being overly cautious. She asked whether other clients had similar numbers, and seemed to interpret Pemba's concern as doubt about her capability, rather than legitimate medical observation. That evening, she posted content describing the day's climb as difficult but successful, making no mention of her oxygen saturation readings or Pemba's recommendations. Her narrative remained consistent. She was pushing through challenges, adapting to the mountain, proving that determination could overcome obstacles. Also climbing with Summit Quest was Marcus Chan, 41, an emergency room physician from Seattle who had completed multiple high-altitude expeditions, including Denali, Aconcagua, and Cho-Oyu. Marcus had summited Cho-Oyu the previous year, reaching 26,864 feet without supplemental oxygen, demonstrating exceptional acclimatization capacity. His approach to climbing emphasized preparation and caution. He had trained rigorously, reviewed medical literature on high-altitude physiology, and approached Everest with respect for its dangers. Marcus was climbing with his assigned Sherpa, Lakpat Sering, 38, who had completed 13 Everest summits and was regarded as one of the most experienced guides working for Summit Quest. The third member was Sarah Lindstrom, 37, a high school teacher from Minnesota attempting her first 8,000-meter peak. Sarah had climbed Island Peak and Mara Peak in previous years, building a solid foundation of high-altitude experience. She was fit, cautious, and keenly aware of her limitations. Her assigned Sherpa was Dawa Gyaljan, 29, completing his 6th Everest season. The three clients became acquainted during rest days at base camp, sharing meals and discussing their preparations. Chelsea positioned herself as part of this group, posting photos with Marcus and Sarah that suggested camaraderie and shared capability. Marcus and Sarah were polite but maintained professional distance, both recognizing that Chelsea's experience level did not match their own. The critical rotation to Camp 3 occurred on May 11th. The climb from Camp 2 required ascending the Lhotse face, a steep blue ice wall that rose more than 2,000 vertical feet at angles between 40 and 50 degrees. Fixed ropes provided security, but the climbing demanded sustained cardiovascular effort and technical competence. Chelsea reached Camp 3 after 9 hours of climbing that left her completely exhausted. After warming her hands and taking multiple readings to confirm the result, her oxygen saturation at Camp 3 measured 62%, a number that placed her in dangerous territory. Pemba insisted they descend immediately, that continuing with these numbers would risk pulmonary or cerebral edema. Chelsea refused. She had not paid $70,000 to quit before the summit. She had trained for this. She had promised her followers she would reach the top. Descending now would destroy the narrative she had built over 14 months. She accused Pemba of undermining her confidence, of treating her differently from male climbers, of failing to provide the support she had paid for. The argument became heated enough that other climbers could hear raised voices from inside Chelsea's tent. Pemba radioed the expedition leader at base camp and explained the situation. The response was bureaucratic and unsatisfying. Chelsea had signed comprehensive liability waivers. Her vital signs were concerning but not immediately life-threatening, and forcing her descent would create legal and reputational complications for the company. Unless she became obviously incapacitated, the decision to continue was legally hers to make. Pemba was advised to document his concerns and continue providing support. The descent from Camp 3 to Camp 2 the following morning went slowly but without incident. Chelsea managed the technical sections adequately, and they reached Camp 2 in the early afternoon. They continued to base camp the next day to rest before the summit window. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth coverage matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like helps support the channel. Make more videos like this. Now let's get back to the mountain. The weather window opened on May 18th. Meteorologists predicted a brief 36-hour period of reduced winds before another storm system moved in. Summit Quest finalized its climbing roster. Marcus and Sarah were cleared to attempt the summit, both having demonstrated excellent acclimatization and technical competence. Chelsea was explicitly excluded. Her oxygen saturation readings, her 9-hour ascent times, and her near paralysis on technical terrain made her a liability the company was unwilling to accept. The expedition leader delivered the news in person, explaining that she could attempt the summit in a future season after gaining more experience. Chelsea's response was immediate and calculated. She threatened to destroy Summit Quest's reputation across every platform where she had influence. She would post videos describing how the company had taken her money, led her to believe she would be supported, and then abandoned her within sight of the summit. She would name Pemba specifically as the guide who had undermined her from the beginning. She would ensure that her 480,000 followers understood exactly how she had been treated. The expedition leader held firm. Chelsea was not climbing. What happened next bypassed Summit Quest entirely. Chelsea approached a smaller budget operator, camped nearby, a company running a bare-bones expedition with minimal oversight and maximum flexibility. She offered $15,000 in cash for a spot on their summit roster. No questions asked. The operator, facing a season with fewer clients than projected, accepted the payment. Chelsea would climb with their team, using their Sherpa support, following their schedule. Summit Quest would not be involved or liable. The budget operator assigned Chelsea to climb with Dorje Lama, a 34-year-old Sherpa with 4 Everest summits, who had never worked with this client and knew nothing about her medical history or performance during acclimatization. He was told only that she was an experienced climber, transferring from another expedition. Chelsea told him her oxygen saturation had been reading in the high 70s throughout the rotation, a lie that would prove catastrophic. Dorje had heard rumors circulating through base camp about a social media climber who had been banned from her original expedition, but he had no reason to connect those rumors to the confident American woman now assigned to his rope. The budget operator had not shared details, and Dorje had not asked. In commercial guiding, clients came and went, and questions about why someone had switched expeditions were rarely welcomed. He assumed she had disagreed with her previous company over scheduling or fees, personality conflicts that happened every season. He did not assume she had been deemed medically unfit to climb. The summit push began on the evening of May 19th. Teams departed Camp 4 at staggered intervals, headlamps creating a serpentine chain of light ascending the southeast ridge. Chelsea started strong, the supplemental oxygen masking some of her body's distress, but her pace began deteriorating above the balcony at 27,600 feet. She stopped every 40 feet, her breathing ragged even through the oxygen mask, her legs trembling with each step. By the time she reached 28,000 feet, she had fallen far behind her assigned team. Dorje stayed with her, growing increasingly concerned as her condition deteriorated. Other climbing teams began stacking up behind them on the fixed ropes. The route narrowed to a single line in several sections, and Chelsea's glacial pace was creating a bottleneck that affected everyone ascending behind her. Marcus, Sarah, and their Sherpas were among those trapped in the growing queue. What should have been a steady climb became a stop-and-start ordeal, with teams waiting 10 and 15 minutes at a time, while Chelsea struggled through sections that competent climbers cleared in moments. The delays pushed everyone's timeline backward, consuming the safety margin that separated a successful summit from a fatal one. At 28,200 feet, approximately 600 feet below the summit, Chelsea collapsed. She sat down on the fixed line, her legs folded beneath her, and did not respond when Dorje urged her to stand. Her eyes were unfocused, her speech slurred when she spoke at all. The signs of cerebral edema were unmistakable. Her brain was swelling from the altitude, and without immediate descent, she would die. But Chelsea was blocking the only route. The fixed line ran through a narrow traverse where climbers could not easily pass, and her position made it impossible for ascending teams to continue or for descending teams to get through efficiently. Dorje radioed for help, his voice tight with controlled panic. Climbers began stacking up on both sides of the blockage, some trying to summit, others trying to descend before conditions deteriorated further. The mathematics of the situation was brutal. Every minute spent stationary at 28,200 feet cost climbers oxygen they could not replace and body heat they could not regenerate. The human body consumes roughly 4 liters of bottled oxygen per minute at that altitude, with regulators set to standard flow rates. The teams stacked behind Chelsea were burning through their supplies while accomplishing nothing, watching their survival margins shrink with each passing moment. Some climbers had planned their oxygen loads down to the hour. Those plans were now meaningless. Dawa Gyaltsen moved forward to help. He had been climbing behind Sarah when the bottleneck formed, and his instinct was to assist however he could. He clipped into the fixed line beside Chelsea and began trying to lift her, to move her to a position where other climbers could pass. The situation was chaotic. Multiple people shouting instructions, the wind building steadily, the cold sapping everyone's reserves. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. As Dawa struggled with Chelsea's weight, she lurched sideways in a moment of confused resistance, her arm swinging outward and catching Dawa across the chest. The impact was not forceful, but at 28,200 feet, on a narrow traverse with a 40-degree ice slope falling away below, it was enough. Dawa's crampon points skittered on the hard-packed snow. His grip on the fixed rope slipped. He fell backward, his safety tether shock-loading against an anchor that was already bearing the weight of multiple climbers. The anchor held. Dawa's tether did not. The carabiner gate, stressed beyond its design limits by the angular load, failed catastrophically. Dawa Gyaltsen fell more than 800 feet down the southeast face, his body disappearing into the gray void before anyone could react. His remains were never recovered. The The chaos that followed was absolute. Climbers who had witnessed the fall were screaming. Others were trying to push past Chelsea's still motionless form to begin their own descent. The carefully coordinated summit push had collapsed into every man for himself survival. Pemba was not supposed to be there. After Chelsea was banned from Summit Quest's roster, he had been reassigned to support the summit team, carrying extra oxygen and emergency supplies, a role that placed him above Camp 4 during the window. When Dawa fell, Pemba was 300 feet below, ascending with cached bottles. He heard the commotion on the radio and pushed upward to help. What Pemba found was a disaster in progress. Chelsea was barely conscious, blocking the route. Dorja was overwhelmed, trying to manage his client while other climbers shoved past. Marcus and Lakpa were attempting to coordinate an orderly descent, but the traffic jam had made efficient movement impossible. Sarah was showing early signs of altitude sickness, confusion, slowed responses that would worsen rapidly if she remained at this elevation. Pemba took charge because someone had to. He physically lifted Chelsea and moved her to a small platform off the main route, clearing the fixed line for other climbers. He directed traffic, telling ascending teams to turn back immediately, creating space for descending climbers to move. He burned through his own energy reserves doing work that should have been shared among multiple Sherpas, but the others were scattered across the mountain, dealing with their own emergencies. The descent became a running battle against time. Sarah's condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. The cerebral edema that had begun as confusion and slowed responses progressed into something worse. She began speaking to people who were not there, asking Lakpa questions about her classroom in Minnesota, calling him by her father's name. By 27,500 feet, Lakpa was essentially dragging her, her legs moving in mechanical steps, but her mind no longer connected to her body. Her eyes were open, but she saw nothing on the mountain. Whatever Sarah was experiencing in her final hours existed somewhere far from the southeast ridge. Marcus helped where he could, but his own oxygen was running low, and the cold was beginning to affect his coordination. Chelsea was being half carried by Dorja and another Sherpa who had descended from above, her weight slowing everyone behind her. At 27,000 feet, Sarah stopped breathing. Lakpa checked for a pulse and found nothing. He attempted rescue breathing, but at that altitude, with that level of oxygen deprivation, there was nothing to be done. They left her body clipped to the fixed line and continued down. Pemba reached Camp 4 at 11 in the morning, more than 12 hours after the summit push began. He had been above 26,000 feet for nearly 20 hours, far longer than the human body could sustain without consequences. His oxygen had run out 2 hours earlier. His movements were uncoordinated, his speech slurred, his skin showing the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia. He collapsed outside a tent and did not get up. Other climbers found him 40 minutes later. They dragged him inside, forced warm fluids into him, and covered him with sleeping bags. His core temperature had dropped to 87 degrees Fahrenheit. His heart was beating erratically, struggling to pump blood that had thickened in the cold. At 2:47 p.m., surrounded by climbers who had done everything they could, Pemba Nuru's heart stopped. He was 31 years old. Sarah Lindstrom's body remained on the upper southeast ridge for the remainder of the season, clipped to the fixed rope just below 27,000 feet. Recovery was deemed impossible given her position, the weather, and the continued congestion on the route. Marcus Chen made it down to Camp 2 alive, but his condition continued to deteriorate. Despite supplemental oxygen and aggressive warming, Marcus's breathing worsened overnight, turning rapid and wet as fluid filled his lungs. At 21,200 feet, his oxygen levels continued to fall despite maximum flow. In the early hours of May 21st, Marcus went into cardiac arrest inside his tent at Camp 2. Resuscitation efforts failed. He was pronounced dead shortly after sunrise. The official cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema, compounded by prolonged hypoxia. He was 41 years old. Chelsea Monroe survived. She was evacuated by helicopter from Camp 2 the following day, suffering from severe frostbite and the lingering effects of cerebral edema. She lost 2 fingers on her left hand and portions of 3 toes. She never reached the summit of Everest. Lakpa Tsering survived with similar injuries. 8 other climbers died during the same weather window, pushing the season's death toll to 11, one of the deadliest in recent Everest history. The investigation cited multiple contributing factors, including weather, overcrowding, inadequate screening, and cascading delays caused by an unqualified climber during the summit window. Chelsea's name appeared in the final report, though no charges were filed. The families of Dawa Gyaltsen and Pemba Nuru each received $15,000 in expedition insurance, roughly 3 years of guiding income. Pemba's 3 children moved in with his parents in Forts Village. Sarah Lindstrom's family received her personal effects. Marcus Chen's body was returned to the United States, his death recorded as the result of high-altitude exposure during rescue efforts. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now